Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I remember that summer like it happened yesterday, not 40-some years ago. I'd just turned 17 in April of 1981, finished 11th grade, and was working part-time at Grayson's Hardware in Jackson Creek. My parents were fighting constantly that summer, making our small house feel like a pressure cooker. Between that and the mind-numbing routine of stocking shelves and mixing paint, I needed to get away. Just me, the outdoors, and nobody telling me what to do. When my buddy Ted mentioned he was heading to his cousin's wedding in New Hampshire, I saw my chance. His route would take him straight through Vermont, so I asked if he could drop me at the edge of Green Mountain National Forest. I had my old man's permission, sort of. I told him I was camping with Ted and his family, and he didn't ask questions. He was too busy shouting at my mom about the phone bill. I packed my Chevy pickup with everything I figured I'd need. My two-man tent, sleeping bag, Coleman stove, fishing gear, a cooler full of food, my hunting knife, and a few paperbacks. The camper shell I'd bought second-hand for $200 would keep everything dry if it rained. I wasn't bringing any guns, didn't have a reason to, and my dad would have noticed if his rifle went missing. Ted dropped me off at a Forest Service road on July 7th. "You sure about this, Marty?" he asked, looking doubtfully at the dense pine forest. "A week alone out here. What if something happens?" I hefted my external frame backpack. "Nothing's gonna happen. I'll be back at this exact spot on the 14th. Just don't forget to pick me up." He shrugged. "Your funeral, man." I watched his Pontiac kick up dust as it disappeared down the dirt road, then climbed into my truck and followed the Forest Service road deeper into the wilderness. The farther I drove, the more the tension drained from my shoulders. Birds called from the trees, wind rustled through pine needles. The radio faded to static, so I clicked it off and rolled down the windows to smell the forest. I drove for nearly 2 hours, taking side roads whenever I found them, going deeper and deeper until I was sure no tourists or rangers would stumble across me. Eventually, I found a small clearing about 30 yards off a rarely used fire road. Perfect, secluded, but with a clear path back to civilization when I needed it. The first 3 days were exactly what I'd hoped for. I fished in a stream about a quarter-mile from my campsite, caught enough trout to supplement the sandwiches and canned beans I'd brought. I hiked without a destination, just following game trails and exploring. I swam in a small, ice-cold pond I discovered on the second day. At night, I built small fires, cooked my dinner, and read until my flashlight batteries started to dim, then crawled into the back of my pickup to sleep in my sleeping bag. No parents fighting, no cash register beeping, just trees, sky, and silence. On the 4th day, rain moved in. Not a downpour, just a steady drizzle that soaked everything and made hiking miserable. I spent the afternoon in the cab of my truck, reading The Stand and listening to raindrops on the metal roof. When evening came, the rain let up, but the ground was too wet for a fire. I heated a can of beef stew on my Coleman stove, ate it straight from the can, and turned in early, grateful for the camper shell keeping my sleeping bag dry. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the occasional patter of residual raindrops falling from tree branches onto the roof. The footsteps woke me. At first, I wasn't sure what I was hearing. Heavy, deliberate steps circling my truck. Squish-thump, squish-thump. Someone or something walking slowly through the mud around my vehicle. I froze, instantly awake. My watch read 2:17 a.m. The inside of the camper shell was pitch black. A bear, I thought. Has to be a bear. Maybe drawn by the smell of the beef stew I'd rinsed out before bed. I'd hung my cooler from a tree branch 20 yards away, like you're supposed to, but I'd been careless with trash. The footsteps continued, circling, pausing, then circling again. I held my breath and listened. The steps were too rhythmic, too deliberate for a foraging bear. And something else. They sounded bipedal. 2 feet, not 4 paws. That's when I heard the breathing. Heavy, ragged breaths, like someone who'd run a long distance, but distorted somehow, deeper than any human breathing I'd ever heard. The closest comparison I could think of was Darth Vader, that mechanical, measured inhalation-exhalation I knew from seeing Star Wars a dozen times. But this was organic, natural, and loud, so loud it sounded like whoever, whatever, was breathing was standing inches from where I lay. I didn't move, didn't call out. Every instinct told me to stay silent, to pretend I wasn't there. The breathing circled with the footsteps, sometimes fading slightly, sometimes growing louder. At one point, it was so close to the rear window of the camper shell that I swear I felt the hairs on my neck stir from the exhalation. Then came the blow. Wham! Something hit the side of my truck with tremendous force. Not a punch or a kick. This sounded like someone had swung a sledgehammer against the metal panel behind the cab. The truck actually rocked from the impact. I bit back a shout, my heart hammering in my chest. The blow wasn't repeated, but a new sound started. A scraping noise like claws or fingernails dragging down the driver's side door. The sound made my teeth hurt, metal against metal, or nails against metal. Whatever was out there pressed against the truck, rocking it slightly. I could feel the suspension give under the weight. Another blow struck the roof of the cab, not as hard as the first, but enough to make a booming sound in the quiet forest. More breathing, more circling. The awful scraping sound again, this time on the camper shell itself, inches from my head. I had my hunting knife clutched in my right hand by then, though I knew it would be useless against anything large enough to rock my truck. My left hand gripped my flashlight, but I didn't dare turn it on. I didn't want to give away my exact position inside the camper. For what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes, this continued, circling, breathing, occasional blows to the vehicle, scraping, pushing. Then abruptly it stopped. The silence was almost worse than the sounds, at least before I knew where the thing was. Now I strained my ears, desperate for any clue. Had it left? Was it waiting perfectly still for me to emerge? I didn't move for another hour. My muscles cramped, my bladder ached, but I didn't move. Eventually birds began to sing. First one, then several, their dawn chorus gradually filling the forest. Grey light seeped through the small windows of the camper shell. Still, I waited. When sunlight finally streamed through the trees, I cautiously sat up. My neck and back were stiff from lying tensed for hours. I peered through the rear window of the camper shell, scanning the clearing. Nothing moved except branches in the morning breeze. I had to pee so badly it hurt, but I still hesitated before unlocking the camper shell's door. What if it was still out there? What if it was just waiting for me to emerge? In the end, physical need overcame fear. I slowly, quietly unlocked the door and pushed it open a crack, peering out. The clearing looked normal, peaceful even, with morning sun turning dewdrops into diamonds on every surface. I climbed out, knife still in hand, and quickly relieved myself against a nearby tree, eyes darting constantly around the clearing. Only when that urgent need was addressed did I turn my attention to the truck itself. Jesus Christ, I whispered. The driver's side door bore 4 parallel gouges, deep enough to expose the metal beneath the blue paint. They ran diagonally from the window down to the door handle, about 4 feet in length. Each gouge was nearly an inch wide. I walked around the truck, inspecting it. The rear panel had a massive dent where the first blow had landed. The roof of the cab had another, smaller dent, but what made my blood run cold were the handprints. Enormous handprints pressed into the dust and moisture on the hood and sides of my truck. Each one was easily 14 inches from heel of palm to fingertip. The fingers were splayed out, and I could see clear impressions where thick fingernails had dug slightly into the grime. Human-shaped, but not human-sized. Then I looked down and saw the tracks. The ground around my truck was soft from yesterday's rain, and pressed into the mud were footprints. Bipedal footprints with 5 clear toes. The same basic shape as a human foot, but massive, at least 16 inches long, twice the length of my own work boots. The impression was deep, suggesting whatever made them was extremely heavy. The footprints circled my truck exactly as I'd heard the footsteps doing hours earlier. Some approached from the direction of the stream. Others led away into the dense forest. As I stood there, the breeze shifted, and I caught a smell, a powerful, rank odor like wet animal fur, mixed with something musky and pungent. It reminded me of the time I'd helped my uncle butcher a deer that had been dead too long. I didn't need any more convincing. With shaking hands, I gathered my scattered gear, not bothering to properly pack anything. I threw my sleeping bag, stove, and other equipment haphazardly into the back of the truck, slammed the camper shell door, and practically dove into the driver's seat. The gouged door squealed in protest as I yanked it open, then closed it behind me. I fumbled with the keys, dropping them once before finally getting them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of that clearing, spraying mud and pine needles behind me. I drove too fast on the narrow fire road, branches scraping the sides of my truck. Twice I nearly slid off the muddy track, but I didn't slow down until I reached the main Forest Service road. Even then, I kept the speedometer needle above 50, taking curves faster than was safe, desperate to put distance between me and whatever had visited my camp in the night. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station at the edge of the national forest. The teenage attendant gave me a strange look as I stumbled toward the restroom, my face pale and hands still trembling. "You okay, man?" he called. I managed to nod but didn't trust my voice. In the grimy bathroom mirror, I hardly recognized myself. My eyes were wild, my hair sticking up in all directions. I looked like I'd seen a ghost, or something worse. I splashed cold water on my face, used the toilet, then bought a large coffee and a packaged sandwich from the small store attached to the station. I sat in my truck, sipping the bitter coffee, trying to process what had happened. In daylight, surrounded by normal sounds of passing cars and people pumping gas, it seemed almost dreamlike. Had I imagined it? Maybe it was just a black bear, and my half-asleep brain had magnified everything. Then I looked at the deep gouges on my door. No bear made those marks, and no bear left gigantic human-shaped handprints on my hood. I drove straight home. 7 hours without stopping except for gas. Ted would be pissed when he found out I wasn't there for pickup, but I'd deal with that later. I needed to be somewhere safe, somewhere normal. My parents were surprised to see me. "Thought you were with Ted until next week," my dad said, eyeing my disheveled appearance suspiciously. "Plans changed," I mumbled, heading straight for my room. I fell onto my bed, exhausted, and slept for 14 hours straight. The next day, my grandfather stopped by. He was my dad's father, a retired logger who'd spent 50 years working in forests across the Northeast. If anyone would know what to make of what happened, it would be him. We sat on the front porch steps, away from my bickering parents. I told him everything, not leaving out a single detail. I described the footsteps, the breathing, the blows to my truck. I told him about the footprints, the handprints, the gouges in the door. I even reluctantly admitted how terrified I'd been. Grandpa listened silently, his weathered face giving nothing away. When I finished, he reached for his pipe, packed it methodically with tobacco and lit it. Blue smoke curled around his grey head as he considered my story. Finally, he spoke. "There ain't no bears that'll track you like that." "What do you think it was?" I asked. He puffed his pipe for a minute, eyes distant. "Reckon you're mighty lucky, Marty. Not everyone lives to tell about an encounter like that." A chill ran down my spine, despite the July heat. "What do you mean? What do you think it was, Grandpa?" He looked at me directly, his blue eyes sharp and clear in his lined face. "Those foot and handprints make me believe it was a Sasquatch." He said it matter-of-factly, like he was telling me it was going to rain. A Sasquatch? Like Bigfoot? I almost wanted to laugh, but the memory of those massive handprints and the sound of that unnatural breathing stopped me. "Call it what you want," he said. "Been stories about them in these mountains since before my time. Most loggers I knew had a story or two, though many wouldn't admit it sober." He tapped his pipe against the step. "They're curious about us mostly. Sometimes get aggressive if you're in their territory, but they don't often hurt folks." "Often?" I repeated. Grandpa didn't elaborate. He just looked at the scratches on my truck, parked in the driveway, and nodded slowly. "Why'd it circle my truck like that? Why not just move on?" I asked. "Curious," he said simply. "Probably smelled you inside. Wanted to see what you were. Maybe it was a young one testing its strength." Hard to say. I didn't know if I believed him. Part of me wanted to dismiss the whole thing as a bear encounter combined with an overactive imagination, but I couldn't explain those handprints, or the footprints, or the gouges. Grandpa must have sensed my doubt. "Next time you're in the woods, Marty, remember you're not at the top of the food chain." He stood up, joints creaking. "And maybe stick to campgrounds with other people around." I never went back to Green Mountain National Forest, never went solo camping again either. Ted was furious when I wasn't at the pickup spot until I showed him the scratches on my truck. After that, he stopped giving me grief about it. The truck eventually got repainted, but I never forgot what happened that night. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed and the house is quiet, I swear I can still hear that heavy, rhythmic breathing right outside my window, like Darth Vader standing inches away, waiting. Story 2. I checked my watch as I pulled back onto the empty road. 1:47 a.m., January 18th, 2003. The snowstorm that had started around 9 had gotten worse, reducing visibility to maybe 20 feet beyond my headlights. 6 months into my job as a police officer with the Bonner County Sheriff's Department, and I'd drawn the short straw, night shift patrol, during what the locals were calling the worst winter in 15 years. The radio crackled. "Unit 14, this is dispatch. We've got a report of a vehicle stranded on Hitchfield Road, about 5 miles east of the junction. Driver says their engine won't start, possibly frozen. Can you respond?" I grabbed the handset. "Copy that, dispatch. I'm about 10 minutes out, heading there now." "Copy, Unit 14. Driver's name is Martha Kennings. Says she's in a blue Honda Civic." I flicked on my sirens, not for the speed, as I couldn't risk going over 30 mph in these conditions, but to make sure any other vehicles would see me coming through the curtain of white. The wipers struggled against the heavy snowfall, and I leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. Hitchfield Road was one of those forgotten stretches that wound through densely forested areas with steep drops on either side. No streetlights, no houses, just trees and wilderness. During my police academy training back in Boise, they'd warned us about these isolated roads, where people go to dump things they don't want found, the instructor had said. In summer, we'd find abandoned cars or illegal trash dumps. In winter, we mostly found stranded drivers or the occasional deer carcass hit by passing vehicles. My tires crunched over the freshly fallen snow as I made the turn onto Hitchfield. The road narrowed immediately, with thick pines pressing in on both sides, their branches heavy with accumulated snow. The headlights of my patrol car carved a tunnel through the darkness, illuminating swirling snowflakes that danced in the beams. The radio crackled again. "Unit 14, update on the stranded vehicle. Driver reports she got the car started and is heading home. No assistance required." I felt both relief and annoyance. Relief because I wouldn't have to worry about coordinating a tow truck in this weather, or worse, giving someone a ride back to town in my cruiser. Annoyance because I'd driven all this way for nothing. "Copy that, dispatch. I'll head back to town." I slowed down, looking for a place to turn around on the narrow road. Finding a slightly wider section, I carefully executed a 3-point turn, my tires sliding slightly in the fresh powder. As I straightened out and headed back toward the main road, I noticed something in my peripheral vision, a dark shape in the ditch about 50 yards ahead. My first thought was a deer, probably hit by a car and crawled off the road to die. It happened frequently in these parts, especially during storms when visibility was poor. I slowed down, planning to report it to animal control in the morning. No sense in having a rotting carcass so close to the road come spring thaw. As my headlights fully illuminated the scene, I realized something was wrong. There was definitely a deer in the ditch. I could make out the tan hide, but something else was hunched over it, something massive. My first coherent thought was bear. We had black bears in the area, and even the occasional grizzly. But bears should be hibernating in January, and this creature was simply too big, its shoulders too broad and high, even in its hunched position. I slowed to a complete stop about 30 feet away, keeping my engine running and lights trained on the scene. The creature didn't initially react to my presence. It continued working at the deer carcass, which I could now see was partially frozen, its blood dark against the white snow. Steam rose from the exposed innards as the cold air hit them. What I saw next froze the blood in my veins. The creature's hands, if you could call them that, ended in thick, coal-black claws that had to be at least 3 inches long. They sliced through the deer's hide and muscle with sickening ease, pulling away strips of meat that disappeared into what I assumed was its mouth, though I couldn't see its face from my angle. Dense, dark brown fur covered its entire body, matted in some places with what looked like blood and ice. The fur wasn't uniform. It hung longer around what appeared to be its head and shoulders, giving it an almost mane-like appearance. I sat paralyzed, my training completely abandoned. This wasn't covered in any police manual. I hadn't turned on my dashcam, a stupid rookie mistake. But in that moment I was almost grateful. No one would believe this footage anyway. Then it happened. Whether it was the engine noise, the headlights, or just some animal sense I couldn't comprehend, the creature suddenly stopped feeding. Its massive shoulders tensed, and with deliberate slowness, it swiveled its head toward my patrol car. The face that turned toward me will haunt me until my dying day. Not quite bear, not quite wolf, but somehow incorporating the most predatory aspects of both. Its snout was elongated but blunt at the end, with nostrils that flared as it scented the air. But it was the eyes that hit me hardest, red eyes that caught and reflected my headlights with an unnatural fiery glow. They weren't just reflecting light, they seemed to generate their own internal fire. We stared at each other across that snowy expanse for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Then the creature rose to its full height. I automatically reached for my service weapon, a Glock 22 that suddenly felt laughably inadequate. The creature stood fully upright on 2 legs, towering at what had to be 8 feet tall. Its proportions were all wrong for a bear. Too narrow at the waist, too broad at the shoulder, with arms that hung too long and ended in those terrible clawed hands. What happened next broke my paralysis. The creature threw back its head and unleashed a sound I didn't so much hear as feel. A howl that started low like the rumble of distant thunder and rose to a pitch that vibrated through my patrol car, through my chest cavity, and seemed to rattle my very bones. It wasn't just loud, it was physically painful, pressing against my eardrums from the inside. My hand was on my gun, but I didn't draw it. Some primal instinct told me that would be the last mistake I'd ever make. With a sudden explosion of movement that belied its massive size, the creature grabbed the half-eaten deer carcass, a full-grown doe that had to weigh at least 150 pounds, and effortlessly threw it over one shoulder. Then, in a single bound that no bear or wolf could ever manage, it leaped up the steep 8-foot embankment beside the road. I watched in terrified awe as it landed in the field above, its feet barely sinking into the deep snow. It moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for its bulk, each stride covering yards of ground as it bounded across the open field toward the tree line. In seconds, it had reached the forest and disappeared into the darkness between the pines. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat in my patrol car, hands shaking so badly I had to grip the steering wheel to steady them. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, fogging the windshield. I became aware of a warm wetness spreading across my lower back, sweat that had pooled and was now trickling down my spine. My hand moved to the radio, fingers wrapping around the handset. What would I say? Dispatch, I just saw Bigfoot eating a deer. Or maybe, be on the lookout for an 8-foot-tall wolf-bear hybrid with glowing red eyes. In that moment, I remembered what the veterans on the force called rookies, who reported strange things. One-year wonders. Cops who didn't make it past their first year because they couldn't handle the job. I slowly replaced the handset without keying the mic. The department had already been hesitant to hire me, a 23-year-old with no prior law enforcement experience beyond the academy. Chief McGuire had taken a chance on me after I'd moved up from Boise, looking to escape my failed engagement and start fresh. 6 months in, I was still proving myself, still the new guy, still the subject of veterans' scrutiny. A report like this would end my career before it began. I put the car in drive and pressed the gas pedal harder than necessary, causing the tires to spin briefly before catching. I needed distance between myself and this place. As I drove, I checked my rearview mirror compulsively, half expecting to see that hulking form emerge from the trees and charge after my vehicle. The road back to town seemed longer than ever. I kept the car at a steady 40 mph despite the treacherous conditions, slowing only when absolutely necessary. My mind raced with questions and explanations. Maybe it was just a bear, a large, unusually active winter bear. Maybe the red eyes were just a reflection trick. Maybe the howl wasn't as loud as I thought, amplified by my own fear. But those rational explanations crumbled against the vivid memory of what I'd seen. The way it stood upright, the intelligence in those fiery eyes, the impossible speed and agility with which it moved. I reached the outskirts of Sandpoint just after 2:30 a.m. The streets were empty, most buildings dark except for the all-night diner and the gas station. I pulled into the sheriff's department parking lot and killed the engine, but didn't immediately get out. Instead, I sat there trying to compose myself, trying to decide what to do. In the end, I wrote up my patrol report with a simple notation. Responded to stranded vehicle call on Hitchfield Road. Driver had departed before arrival. Observed dead deer in ditch, likely roadkill. Notified animal control for removal. I've been with the department for 20 years now. Made detective after 5 years, got promoted to sergeant 3 years after that. I'm respected, trusted to train the new recruits, known for my steady nerves and attention to detail. And I've never told anyone what I saw that night on Hitchfield Road. But sometimes, when I'm working late and the snow is falling heavy outside the station windows, I hear that howl again, reverberating not through my ears but through my bones. And I wonder if it's still out there, moving through the Idaho wilderness with impossible grace, waiting for another unlucky rookie to stumble upon its midnight feast. Story 3. The call came in at 3:17 a.m. on January 14, 2000. I remember checking my watch as I fumbled for the phone, my wife Carol stirring beside me. 20 years as Loudoun County's coroner had conditioned me to these middle-of-the-night summons, but they never got easier. "Matthew's here," I answered, my voice thick with interrupted sleep. "Doc, we got a fatal out on Route 36, about 2 miles past the Miller farm," said dispatch. "Single vehicle into a tree. Sheriff's deputy is on scene." I rubbed my eyes. "I'll be there in 20. The bedroom was dark and cold as I dressed. Carol mumbled something about being careful on the roads. I kissed her forehead and told her to go back to sleep. Outside, the temperature gauge on my truck read 11 degrees. A fresh layer of snow had fallen during the night, about 3 inches, coating everything in sight. The wipers pushed away small drifts as I backed out of the driveway. Route 36 was deserted at that hour. My headlights carved a tunnel through darkness as I drove, the road a narrow ribbon of white. I passed the Miller farm with its crooked mailbox, then spotted the flashing lights ahead. Deputy Jim Hoskins' cruiser and an ambulance were parked at odd angles, their emergency lights painting the snow-covered pines in alternating red and blue. I parked behind the ambulance and grabbed my bag. The scene came into focus as I approached. A dark blue sedan had left the road and collided head-on with a massive oak tree. The front end was accordion folded, the windshield a spider web of cracks. Hoskins approached as I trudged through the snow. He was young, maybe 30, with a bushy moustache and circles under his eyes. "Evening, Doc," he said, stamping his feet against the cold. "Driver's still in there, male, looks to be mid-40s. No ID yet." I nodded, my breath clouding in front of my face. "Anybody call it in?" Trucker spotted it on his run. No witnesses to the actual crash. The victim was slumped over the steering wheel, neck at an unnatural angle. Blood had frozen in thin rivulets down his face. I'd seen plenty of fatal crashes in my time. This one was textbook. Driver likely fell asleep or lost control on the icy road, drifted off, and hit the tree. Death would have been instantaneous from the cervical fracture. "Time of death approximately 2 to 3 hours ago," I said, checking the body's temperature and rigor. "Cause appears to be traumatic neck injury." While the EMTs prepared to extract the body, I walked around the vehicle, completing my examination. That's when I noticed it, a smear of fresh blood on the front left fender. It looked different from the victim's blood, darker, almost black in the flashlight beam, and it wasn't frozen yet. "Jim," I called, pointing to the stain. "Look at this." Hoskins crouched beside me. "Huh. Must have hit a deer before he crashed." I nodded. That made sense. "Probably wounded it. Might still be around here." "Guess we should check," Hoskins said, straightening up. "Don't want some half-dead deer suffering out there." He retrieved a more powerful flashlight from his cruiser, while I told the EMTs we'd be right back. The blood trail wasn't hard to follow. Dark droplets stark against the pristine snow, leading away from the road into the woods. "Shouldn't be far," I said as we entered the tree line, our feet crunching in the fresh powder. The night was silent except for our breathing and footsteps. The air felt brittle with cold. The forest grew denser as we walked, pine branches hanging low with their burden of snow. Our flashlight beams carved yellow paths through the darkness. The blood trail remained consistent, not heavy enough to indicate immediately fatal injuries, but steady enough to show the animal was hurt bad. "Must be just ahead," Hoskins muttered after about 10 minutes of walking. We'd gone maybe a quarter mile into the woods. That's when we heard it, a low rumbling sound, almost like a growl but deeper, resonating through the trees. Hoskins and I stopped in our tracks. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. "What was—" Hoskins began, but I raised my hand to silence him. The sound came again, followed by the crack of a branch breaking under weight. Something big was moving ahead of us, just beyond the reach of our lights. Hoskins raised his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness between 2 massive pines, and there it stood. My first thought was bear, but no, this was standing upright on 2 legs. My second thought was man, but no man looked like this. The creature was enormous, at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. Its broad shoulders had to be 4 feet across, covered in dark, thick fur. Its chest was massive, barrel-shaped, rising and falling with heavy breaths that clouded the air. Snow had collected on its head and shoulders, creating a dusting of white against the dark fur. The creature's face was... God, I still see it when I close my eyes. Not quite human, not quite animal. A prominent brow ridge shadowed deep-set eyes that reflected our flashlight beams like those of a deer caught in headlights. Its jaw was heavy, protruding slightly, but there was an intelligence in its gaze that froze me to the spot. My flashlight beam traveled downward, and I saw what we'd been tracking. Just above the creature's right knee was a gash about 6 inches long. The fur around it was matted with dark blood, still wet and glistening in our light. Snow beneath its foot was stained pink. For what felt like an eternity but must have been only seconds, we stood there, the three of us locked in a tableau. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My heart hammered so hard I thought my ribs might crack. Beside me, Hoskins made a small, choked sound. The creature's breath came in visible puffs. Its massive chest expanded as it drew in air, nostrils flaring. Those eyes, dark, reflective, studied us with what I can only describe as wary recognition. Then, with deliberate slowness, it turned away. I noticed the limp as it moved, favoring the injured leg. 3 massive strides took it between the trees. The movement surprisingly fluid, despite the injury. A shower of snow fell from branches as it passed. Then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. Hoskins and I stood motionless. My mouth was dry as sandpaper. My hands shook so badly I had to shove them in my pockets. "Did you?" Hoskins finally whispered, his voice cracking. "Yeah," I said. "I saw it." What was... I don't know. We backed away slowly, neither of us turning our backs to the spot where the creature had disappeared. When we reached what felt like a safe distance, we turned and half walked, half ran back toward the road, following our own footprints in the snow. We didn't speak again until the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles came into view. "Doc," Hoskins said, grabbing my arm. His face was pale, eyes wide. "What do we tell them?" I looked back at the dark wall of trees, then at the crash scene where the EMTs were loading the victim's body into the ambulance. "Nothing," I said. "We don't tell them anything." "But you want to report we saw a... What, a Bigfoot, a Sasquatch? You think anyone will believe that?" Hoskins swallowed hard. "I guess not." "Then we don't say a word. We looked for a wounded deer, didn't find one. End of story." He nodded slowly. "All right, Doc, if you say so." Back at the scene, the EMTs asked if we'd found anything. I shook my head and said something about the deer probably wandering off to die somewhere deeper in the woods. No one questioned it. I signed the necessary paperwork, documenting the victim's death, and we all went our separate ways. I drove home in a daze, knuckles white on the steering wheel. Every shadow along the roadside made me flinch. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something massive emerging from the trees. When I got home, Carol was still asleep. I stripped off my clothes and stood under a scalding shower for nearly 20 minutes, trying to wash away the chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I didn't sleep for what remained of the night, just lay staring at the ceiling, replaying those moments in the woods over and over. The next day at work, I went through the motions of filing my report on the accident victim. Cause of death: cervical fracture due to blunt force trauma. Nothing unusual, nothing unexplainable. Hoskins called me around noon. "You doing okay, Doc?" he asked, his voice low. "Fine," I lied. "You?" "Yeah, sure." A pause. "I was thinking about, last night." "Nothing to think about," I cut him off. "Just a routine call." Another pause. "Right. Routine." I could tell he wanted to say more, but he didn't. Neither did I. Days passed. I kept expecting something to happen. More sightings, reports of strange tracks in the snow, livestock disappearances. But there was nothing. Life in Loudoun County continued, as it always had. Except I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen. I found myself at the library one afternoon, searching through books on cryptozoology, North American folklore, Bigfoot sightings. Most of it seemed like nonsense. Blurry photos, second-hand accounts, obvious hoaxes, but some of the descriptions matched what we'd seen with uncanny accuracy. A week after the incident, I was sitting in my recliner after dinner when Carol brought me a beer and sat on the arm of the chair. "What's been eating you, Richard?" she asked, running her fingers through my hair. "You've been a million miles away since that accident last week." I looked up at her. We'd been married for 26 years. She knew me better than anyone. If I couldn't tell her, who could I tell? "Something happened that night," I said slowly. "Something I can't explain." I told her everything. The blood trail, the creature in the woods, the silent agreement between Hoskins and me to keep quiet. She listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from concern to disbelief to something like wonder. "You're serious," she said when I finished. "You really believe you saw Bigfoot?" "I don't know what I saw," I admitted. "But I saw something, Carol. Something that shouldn't exist." She was quiet for a long moment. "Have you talked to Jim since then?" "Not really. We've been avoiding each other." "Maybe you should. Compare notes. Make sure you both remember the same thing." She was right, of course. The next day I called Hoskins and asked if he wanted to grab a beer after work. We met at Denny's Tavern, a dim place on the edge of town where we could talk without being overheard. "I told my wife," I said after we'd both downed half our beers. Hoskins nodded. "I told my girlfriend. She thinks I'm crazy." "Carol believes me, I think." We sat in silence for a minute. "I've been having dreams," Hoskins finally said, "about those eyes, the way it looked at us." "Me too." "What do you think it was, Doc? Really?" I shrugged. "Some kind of undiscovered primate? A relic population that's managed to stay hidden? I don't know." "It was intelligent," Hoskins said. "You could see it in its eyes. It was thinking, assessing us." "Yeah, that's what gets me too." We talked for hours that night, going over every detail, confirming that we'd seen the same thing. It helped, knowing I wasn't alone, that I wasn't crazy. In the months that followed, I went back to that stretch of woods a dozen times, always in daylight, always alone. I never found anything. No tracks, no hair, no sign that anything unusual had ever been there. The winter snow melted, spring arrived, and life went on. But I never drive that stretch of Route 36 at night anymore, and sometimes, when I'm called out to remote areas in the small hours of the morning, I feel eyes watching me from the trees. I tell myself it's just nerves, just my imagination playing tricks. But deep down, I know what's out there. I've seen it with my own eyes. And I wonder if it remembers me too. The man who followed its blood trail through the snow, who stood frozen in the dark, face to face with a legend made flesh. 20 years as a coroner taught me to trust what I see, to believe in the evidence before my eyes. That night in January 2000 taught me that some evidence defies explanation. Some truths are better left buried in the woods, like secrets beneath the snow. Story 4. The night had started like any other hunt. The crisp July air of 1999 clung to my skin as I loaded my Remington into the truck bed. Bodine paced anxiously at my feet, his tail whipping back and forth with excitement. He was the best coonhound in Logan County, maybe in all of southern West Virginia. That dog had treed more raccoons than I could count over our 7 years together. His nose worked better than any hunting gadget you could buy at Bass Pro. "Easy, boy," I said, scratching behind his ears. "We'll get out there soon enough." I climbed into my '87 Ford and fired up the engine. Bodine jumped into the passenger seat and stuck his head out the window as we pulled away from my double wide. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness as we headed toward the hills behind the old Blackwell coal mine. Those woods had been good to us. 3 coons last week alone. The clock on my dashboard read 10:17 p.m. when I killed the engine at the end of the dirt access road. The forest loomed ahead, a wall of black punctuated by the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. I grabbed my headlamp from the glove compartment and strapped it on. The rifle came next, then my hunting vest with extra shells in the pockets. "Ready, boy?" I asked. Bodine was already at the edge of the trees, nose to the ground, vibrating with anticipation. His coat gleamed copper in the beam of my light. "Let's get 'em." We pushed into the forest, following a familiar path that wound between oak and hickory trees. My boots crunched on fallen leaves and broken twigs. Bodine stayed close for the first 15 minutes, zigzagging ahead of me, but always doubling back, testing the air for scents. It was nearly 11 p.m. when he caught something. His head snapped up, ears perked forward. Then he let out that distinctive bawl that told me he was on to something. "Go get it, Bo," I called out. The hound shot off into the darkness, his excited barks growing fainter as he pushed deeper into the woods. This was normal. I'd follow his voice until he treed something, then I'd catch up and assess the situation. But something felt different this time. Bodine's barks changed tone about 5 minutes in. They grew more urgent, higher pitched. Then they stopped completely. I picked up my pace, sweeping my headlamp across the forest floor as I navigated around fallen logs and through dense underbrush. The silence worried me. Bodine never went quiet on a trail unless something was wrong. "Bodine!" I shouted. "Here, boy!" My voice echoed through the trees. No response. I pushed forward, my heartbeat quickening. The forest seemed to close in around me. The normal night sounds, crickets, frogs, the rustle of nocturnal creatures had ceased. The woods held their breath. That's when I heard it. A shriek pierced the night, high, panicked, and unmistakably Bodine's. But I'd never heard him make a sound like that before. It wasn't his treeing bark or his alert howl. This was different. This was fear. Pure animal terror that raised the hair on my arms. "Bodine!" I called again, breaking into a run. I crashed through the undergrowth, my headlamp beam bouncing wildly ahead of me. Branches whipped at my face and arms. My lungs burned. The shriek had come from somewhere up ahead, maybe 200 yards through the dense woods. Then I heard something else, a cracking sound, like branches breaking under excessive weight. Not the snap of twigs under a raccoon's paws, or even a deer's hooves. This was heavier, much heavier. I slowed my pace and raised my rifle, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The cracking grew louder, accompanied by the groan of trees being pushed aside. Something big was moving through the forest, heading my way. I switched off my headlamp and crouched low, using the darkness for cover. The moon cast just enough light through the canopy for me to make out shapes. I steadied my breathing, trying to quiet the hammering of my heart. The forest floor vibrated. Whatever was coming through those trees was massive. I readied my rifle, finger hovering near the trigger. A final crash of undergrowth, and it emerged into a small clearing 20 feet ahead of me. My breath caught in my throat. Standing there, illuminated by shafts of moonlight, was a creature I'd heard stories about but never believed existed. It stood at least 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered head to toe in dark brown, shaggy hair. Its shoulders were broader than my brother Clyde's, and Clyde weighed over 500 pounds. Next to this thing, Clyde would look like a child. Its head was massive, the size of a big watermelon, and sat directly on those enormous shoulders with barely any neck to speak of. 2 eyes, black as coal and deeply set, stared out from under a prominent brow ridge. Bigfoot. There was no other word for it. I raised my rifle, hands trembling, and aimed at the center of its chest. One squeeze of the trigger, and I'd have proof of what most considered a myth. My finger tightened, but something stopped me. The creature wasn't acting aggressive. It stood there, breathing heavily, its chest rising and falling. Those coal black eyes weren't filled with rage or hunger. They were curious, intelligent even. We locked eyes, the creature and I, in what felt like the longest minute of my life. I could hear its breathing, deep and rhythmic. I could smell a musky, earthy odor emanating from its body. I could see the moonlight glinting off moisture around its nose, a flat nose with two distinct nostrils above thin lips. My arms began to ache from holding the rifle steady. Sweat trickled down my back despite the cool night air. The creature tilted its head slightly like a dog trying to understand a strange sound. Slowly, deliberately, I lowered my weapon. The creature's eyes followed the movement. I raised my empty left hand, palm outward, in what I hoped was a universal gesture of peace. The Bigfoot's expression didn't change, if these things even had expressions, but something in its posture seemed to relax. It took a step backward, massive feet crunching on the forest floor. I began to back away too, keeping my eyes on the creature. One step, then another. The Bigfoot remained still, watching. When I'd put about 30 feet between us, I turned and ran. My lungs burned as I crashed through the undergrowth, no longer caring about noise or direction. Pure instinct drove me back toward my truck. Branches slashed at my face, roots tried to trip me, but fear kept me upright and moving. I burst out of the tree line near where I'd parked, gasping for air. My truck sat there, a welcome sight in the moonlight. I stumbled toward it, fumbling for my keys. That's when I heard the whining. It came from underneath the truck. I dropped to my knees and peered beneath the chassis. There was Bodine, curled into a tight ball, trembling violently. His eyes were wide with fear. "Bodine," I called softly. "Come here, boy, it's okay." But he wouldn't budge. This dog who had faced down angry raccoons, chased bears, and even tangled with a wildcat once, was paralyzed with terror. I reached under and dragged him out. He weighed about 70 pounds, but felt heavier as dead weight. Once free of the truck, he pressed against my legs, still shaking, still whining low in his throat. I threw open the passenger door and practically lifted him onto the seat. Then I circled around, tossed my rifle in the back, and jumped behind the wheel. The key slid into the ignition on the second try, and the engine roared to life. As I shifted into reverse, my headlights swept across the edge of the forest. For just a second, so brief I almost thought I imagined it, I caught a glimpse of something large moving back into the trees. Then it was gone. I spun the truck around and floored it down the dirt road, gravel spitting from beneath my tires. Bodine huddled on the seat beside me, still trembling but no longer whining. The digital clock on my dashboard read 12:03 a.m. Less than 2 hours had passed since we entered those woods, but it felt like a lifetime. I drove straight home, my mind racing. What I'd seen defied everything I thought I knew about these mountains. I'd hunted these woods since I was 12 years old. My daddy had hunted them before me, and his daddy before him. Not once had any of us mentioned seeing anything like what I'd encountered tonight. When I pulled up to my double-wide, I sat for a long moment with the engine idling. Bodine had finally stopped shaking, but he stuck to me like glue as we went inside. I poured myself 3 fingers of whiskey and downed it in one gulp. The burn helped ground me back in reality. I poured another and sipped it slower. Bodine wouldn't leave my side that night. When I finally went to bed around 3 a.m., he jumped up and curled against my legs, something he'd never done before. I didn't push him away. Sleep came eventually, but it was fitful and filled with dreams of coal-black eyes watching me from the darkness. Morning brought clarity, but no disbelief. What I'd seen was real. The creature had stood before me, massive and impossible, yet undeniably there. I remembered every detail, the way its hair hung longer around its arms, the slight steam of its breath in the cool night air, the way it had regarded me with what seemed like intelligence rather than animal instinct. Over breakfast, I wrestled with what to do. Tell someone. Who would believe me? Keep it to myself? How could I carry that knowledge alone? In the end, I decided to keep quiet. I told folks Bodine had spooked at a bear, which explained his behavior. No one questioned it. Why would they? Bodine never hunted the same after that night. He'd go out with me, but if we approached those particular woods, he'd plant his feet and refuse to continue. After a few attempts, I stopped trying to force him. We found new hunting grounds, and eventually he regained his confidence. But he was never quite the same fearless hound he'd been before. As for me, I've returned to those woods many times over the years, always alone, always armed, but never at night. I've searched for tracks, for hair, for any evidence of what I encountered. I found nothing conclusive, a few unusual depressions in soft ground, some broken branches too high for deer to reach, but nothing that would convince a skeptic. It's been over 20 years now since that summer night in 1999. Bodine passed on 10 years back, a good long life for a coonhound. I've got a new dog now, a young redbone named Tucker. He's good, but he ain't Bodine. Sometimes, when I'm sitting on my porch in the evening, watching the sun sink behind the mountains, I think about those eyes watching me from that massive head. I think about how the creature could have charged me, could have torn me apart with those long arms, but chose instead to observe and then withdraw. I never told anyone the full story until now. Most wouldn't believe it anyway. But I know what I saw in those West Virginia woods. I know it was real. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is still, I swear I can hear heavy footsteps moving through the distant trees. And I wonder if it remembers me too. Story 5. I still wake up sometimes hearing that sound, that rhythmic pounding against the walls, like giant fists trying to break through. Travis tells me it was just the wind, or a bear, or my imagination running wild. But I know what I heard. I know what we all heard that night. My name is Lydia Carpenter, and 2 years ago my boyfriend Travis Miller and I bought what we thought was our dream home in Plains, Montana. A beautiful 2-story house sitting on 20 acres of land with a rock quarry at the top of Deema Creek Road. The price was surprisingly reasonable, almost suspiciously so. The elderly Johnsons had been trying to sell it for nearly a decade. Mr. Johnson clasped my hand a bit too tightly at the closing, his rheumy eyes locking with mine as he whispered, "Take care after sundown." I laughed it off as the ramblings of a superstitious old man. We moved in during late September. The fall colors were in full bloom, painting the mountainside in brilliant reds and golds. Those first few days felt like paradise. Travis would wake up early, kiss me goodbye, and walk the 2 miles down the mountain to his job at the lumberyard. I worked from home, designing websites for small businesses, and the solitude suited me fine. At least, that's what I thought. It was on the 5th night that I first felt it, the sensation of being watched. I was washing dishes, staring out the kitchen window into the pitch-black yard, when the hairs on my neck stood up. Something was out there, looking in at me. I could feel eyes boring into my back, even when I turned away from the window. The next day, I hung thick curtains over every window in the house. It didn't help. The feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing night. I started closing the curtains before sunset, but somehow I still knew when something was out there, staring. Travis came home agitated about 2 weeks after we'd moved in. I was sitting at my desk when he burst through the door, his face flushed and sweaty despite the cool October air. "Something followed me today," he said, dropping his lunchbox on the counter with a clatter. I turned in my chair. "What do you mean, followed you?" "In the woods, alongside the road." Travis grabbed a beer from the fridge, popped it open, and took a long swallow. At first I thought it was a deer or something, but it kept pace with me for almost half a mile. "Did you see it?" He shook his head. "Just heard it. This weird, grunting sound. Not like any animal I've ever heard around here." "A bear, maybe." "Nah, I know what bears sound like. This was different. Lower almost. I don't know. Just different." I didn't tell him about the eyes I felt watching me through the windows. No need to worry him more than he already was. As October turned to November, the incidents increased. Travis reported being followed almost daily on his walks to and from work. We started noticing other things too. Trash cans, knocked over but not rummaged through, like something had just wanted to make noise. Large branches dragged into the yard overnight and arranged in strange patterns. Once, I found all the garden tools from our shed lined up perfectly along the edge of the woods. Kids, Travis insisted. Has to be kids from town messing with the new folks. But the nearest neighbor was over 3 miles away, and the town itself a good 7 miles down the mountain. What kids would hike all the way up Deema Creek Road in the dark just to play pranks? Our friend Marcus came to visit us the weekend before Thanksgiving. He brought his 2 German shepherds, Duke and Rex, massive animals that Marcus had trained for personal protection. Having the dogs around made me feel safer than I had in weeks. Marcus noticed my anxiety as soon as he arrived. "This place is gorgeous, Lydia, but you look like you haven't slept in days." I forced a smile. "Just busy with work. The internet connection up here isn't great." That evening, as we sat around the dinner table, I made a point to tell Marcus not to let the dogs out after dark. "They'll be fine," he said, laughing. "These boys have fought off coyotes before. Just humor me, okay? Keep them inside once the sun goes down." Marcus gave me a strange look, but nodded. After dinner, we watched a movie in the living room. Around 9, Marcus stood up and stretched. "Got to let the boys out for a bathroom break." I grabbed his arm. "It's dark." "They'll be quick," he said, shrugging me off. "Come on, boys." The dogs followed him eagerly to the back door. I shared a worried glance with Travis, who just shrugged. We heard the door open and close, then silence for about 2 minutes. The back door suddenly burst open. Marcus rushed inside, slamming it behind him. The dogs crowded his legs, whimpering, their tails tucked between their legs. "What the hell is up on that hillside?" Marcus demanded, his face pale. Travis stood up. "What did you see?" "Eyes. Red eyes. At least 6 feet off the ground." Marcus's hands were shaking as he locked the door. "And that sound. Jesus. What makes a sound like that? Not a bear, not an elk, nothing I've ever heard." "What sound?" I asked, though I already knew. "Like grunting, but deeper. Almost like words, but not quite. The dogs heard it and just froze." He looked down at Duke and Rex, who were still trembling against his legs. "These dogs have faced down a mountain lion before and didn't flinch. Whatever's out there scared the shit out of them." We stayed up late that night, talking in low voices, jumping at every creak and groan of the house settling. Marcus tried to convince us to leave with him in the morning. Travis argued that it was probably just a large predator that had wandered into the area. Unusual, but not supernatural. I didn't sleep at all. Around 3 in the morning it started. Thump. A single, heavy impact against the exterior wall of the house, like someone had thrown their body against it. Thump. Thump. 2 more hits, harder this time. The glasses in the kitchen cabinets rattled. "Travis," I whispered, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" He sat up, instantly alert. "What the—" Thump. 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 The impacts moved around the house, methodical, like whatever was out there was testing each wall for weakness. Marcus appeared in our doorway, the dogs cowering behind him. "That's no animal," he said, his voice barely audible over the pounding. The noise continued for almost 20 minutes, sometimes slow and deliberate, sometimes in rapid succession, like massive fists hammering against our home. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. Marcus left the next morning, his dogs practically dragging him to his truck. He promised to call us when he got back to Missoula, but I knew we wouldn't see him up here again. After he left, things escalated. The pounding on the walls became a nightly occurrence, always starting around 3 in the morning. But now, strange things began happening inside the house too. I'd walk into the kitchen to find all the cabinet doors open. The DVD collection would be found scattered across the living room floor in the morning, though neither of us had touched it. Once, I watched in horror as a coffee mug slid across the counter by itself, teetering on the edge before crashing to the floor. The worst was the voices. The first time I heard it, I was alone in the house. Travis had gone to work, and I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth. A man's voice, clear as day, said, "Hey," right behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but no one was there. I convinced myself I'd imagined it until it happened again while Travis was on the phone with his buddy Steve. Travis froze mid-sentence, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" he asked Steve. Then to me, "Did you say something?" I shook my head. Steve's tinny voice came through the phone speaker. "Who the hell was that?" Sounded like some dude said "hey" right into the phone. We bought 2 large dogs in December, a Rottweiler named Tank and a Mastiff we called Brick. They were supposed to make us feel safer. Instead, they confirmed our fears. Neither dog would go outside after sunset. They'd stand at the door, growling at the darkness, their hackles raised and teeth bared. If we tried to force them, they'd flatten themselves to the floor, whimpering and refusing to move. One night in January, during a heavy snowfall, I found footprints circling our house. They were roughly humanoid but massive, at least 16 inches long and very wide. The stride length was impossible, with some steps nearly 8 feet apart. Travis insisted they were just distorted by the snow melting and refreezing. But I knew better. I'd been having dreams, or visions maybe. Since I was a kid, I'd sometimes know things before they happened. My grandmother had the same gift, or curse, depending on how you look at it. In these dreams, I kept hearing the same word over and over, Sasquatch. I laughed it off at first. Bigfoot wasn't real. It was just campfire stories and hoaxes. But the word kept coming back, night after night, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. I started researching, reading accounts of Sasquatch encounters in the Pacific Northwest. Many described the same things we were experiencing: wood knocking, strange grunts, feelings of being watched, large footprints. Some even mentioned objects being moved or arranged, just like our garden tools had been. When I told Travis my theory, he thought I'd lost my mind. "You think Bigfoot is haunting our house?" he asked, laughing. "Come on, Lydia. Next you'll tell me the Loch Ness Monster is in our quarry." "I'm not saying it's Bigfoot exactly," I argued, "but something's out there, something intelligent." "If it's so intelligent, why doesn't it just talk to us, instead of playing childish pranks?" I didn't have an answer for that. February brought the worst snowstorm in decades. We were snowed in for nearly a week, the road impassable. Strangely, during that time, the phenomena stopped completely. No pounding, no objects moving, no voices. It was as if whatever was out there had given us a reprieve. The night the plow finally cleared our road, it all came rushing back. The pounding was more intense than ever, so violent that pictures fell from the walls. A voice, that same male voice, called my name from the empty guest bedroom. Tank and Brick huddled under our bed, refusing to come out. Travis finally admitted something wasn't right. "We need to get someone up here," he said. "A priest or, I don't know, an exorcist or something." But I shook my head. "It's not in the house, Travis. It's outside, and I don't think it wants to hurt us." "How can you say that? It's terrorizing us." "If it wanted to hurt us, it could have broken in by now. I think it's trying to communicate, or maybe marking its territory, warning us." Travis stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "You're defending this thing now." "I'm just saying, I never feel threatened when I'm inside. It's only when I think about going out after dark that I get scared." By March, we'd settled into a strange routine. During daylight hours, we lived normally. After sunset, we locked every door and window, drew the curtains tight, and tried to ignore the watching eyes, the occasional thump against the walls, the objects that moved by themselves. We had rules. No going outside after dark. No opening the curtains at night. No responding to voices or sounds. As long as we followed these rules, whatever was out there seemed content to just remind us of its presence without escalating further. One afternoon in late April, a black SUV pulled into our driveway. Two men in suits introduced themselves as representatives from Montana Stone and Gravel. They were interested in our quarry. "We've been looking at the geological surveys of this area," one of them explained. "Your property sits on what might be a significant limestone deposit. We'd like to make you an offer." The offer was substantial, 3 times what we'd paid for the property. Travis and I discussed it that night, the pounding on the walls providing a rhythmic backdrop to our conversation. "We could buy a place in town," Travis said. "No more 2-mile walks to work. No more whatever this is." Part of me wanted to stay. As terrifying as our experiences had been, I'd developed a bizarre respect for whatever shared our mountain. It had rules, boundaries. It had never actually harmed us. But another part of me was exhausted, tired of jumping at every sound, of the constant tension, of having to explain to friends why they couldn't visit after dark. We accepted the offer the following week. As we packed our belongings, the activity increased, almost like it knew we were leaving. The pounding became near constant. Objects flew across rooms with such force they shattered against walls. The dogs refused to enter certain rooms entirely. On our final night in the house, I did something I'd never dared before. I went outside after dark. Travis was asleep, knocked out by exhaustion from a day of loading the moving truck. I slipped out the back door onto the porch, my heart hammering in my chest. The night was clear, stars speckling the black sky above the pine trees. I took a deep breath of the cool mountain air. "I know you're there," I said softly. "We're leaving tomorrow. The house will be empty again." Silence answered me. Then, from the tree line about 50 yards away, I saw them. 2 red eyes glowing in the darkness, at least 7 feet off the ground. A low grunt echoed across the yard. I should have been terrified, but strangely I wasn't. "I'm sorry we invaded your space," I continued. "I hope whoever comes next understands your rules better than we did." Another grunt, followed by what sounded almost like wood knocking against wood, 2 clear taps. I went back inside, locked the door, and slept better than I had in months. We moved to a small house in Plains the next day. 6 months later, we heard through the grapevine that Montana Stone and Gravel had abandoned their plans for the quarry. Their equipment kept breaking down mysteriously. Workers refused to stay on site after sunset. Eventually, they sold the property at a loss to another elderly couple who, as far as I know, have yet to move in. Sometimes I drive up Deema Creek Road in the middle of the day just to look at our old house. It sits there empty and waiting, windows like vacant eyes staring out at the forest. I never go near sunset. I know better now. I don't know if what haunted our home was a Sasquatch, a ghost, or something else entirely. I just know that deep in the mountains of Montana, there are places that belong to things older and stranger than us. Things with their own rules and territories. Things that don't mind sharing, as long as you understand when to stay inside, when to avert your eyes, and when to pretend you don't hear that voice saying, "Hey," right behind you. Story 6. The bright March sun beat down as I drove my daughter's boyfriend Tyler toward St. Regis. Highway 135 stretched out before us, cutting through Sanders County's pine-covered hills and winding alongside the Clark Fork River. It was March 5th, 2004, a date now permanently branded in my memory. "Beautiful day," Tyler said, fiddling with the radio. He found a country station and settled back in the passenger seat. "Sure is," I replied. "Winter's finally breaking." We chatted about nothing important. His classes at the community college, my daughter's new job at the Thompson Falls Clinic, the upcoming fishing season. Normal conversation on what should have been a normal drive. The dashboard clock read 3:52 p.m. when we approached the bridge spanning the Clark Fork. I slowed slightly as we hit the bridge. Habit more than necessity. The steel girders rumbled beneath our tires. I always looked left when crossing here, a habit from years of spotting deer, elk, and once even a moose along the riverbank. Today was no different. At approximately 3:55 p.m., I turned my head toward the water. That's when I saw them. The first thing that registered was the size. Wrong, impossible. Standing on a sandbar that jutted into the river was a towering figure, 8, maybe 10 feet tall. Behind it stood a smaller one, barely reaching the larger being's knee. My brain scrambled to make sense of what my eyes were seeing. "Tyler," I said, my voice tight. "Look left. Now." "What is—" "Holy shit!" His voice cracked. The larger figure stood about 5 or 6 feet behind the smaller one, arms outstretched, taking a step forward. The smaller creature leaned forward at the water's edge, seemingly fascinated by chunks of ice floating there. Both were covered in reddish-brown hair, not fur, but hair that looked silky, almost shimmering in the sunlight. The larger one's hair flowed from its upper arms, head, and shoulders in waves. The smaller one had the same colored hair, but shorter. "Are you seeing this?" Tyler whispered. We were already halfway across the bridge. 3 seconds, 4 seconds of viewing at most, and then we were past. The creatures disappeared from view as we reached the other side. Neither of us suggested turning around. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was disbelief. We drove another mile in complete silence. "What the fuck was that?" Tyler finally said. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. "I don't know." "Bears," he offered, but his tone made it clear he didn't believe it. "Bears don't stand like that. Bears don't have that kind of hair. Bears don't—" I stopped myself. What I wanted to say sounded crazy even in my head. "Should we tell someone?" Tyler asked. "Who? What would we say?" We drove the rest of the way to St. Regis without mentioning it again, but I couldn't stop seeing them in my mind, those figures by the river, that fluid movement, that hair catching the sunlight. For 4 months, I told no one. Not my husband Jim, not my daughter Chelsea, not my 8-year-old son Evan. What would I say? That I saw Bigfoot and his kid playing by the river? They'd think I was crazy. Some mornings I wondered if I was. But Tyler knew. Sometimes when he came over for dinner, our eyes would meet across the table, and I knew he was thinking about it too. Once, when we were alone in the kitchen, he whispered, "I still remember that day on the bridge." I just nodded. What else could I do? By July, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to go back. I needed to know if I had imagined the whole thing. "I'm taking Evan down to the river today," I announced at breakfast. "Tyler, you want to come? We could take some pictures for Chelsea's project." Chelsea's project was a convenient excuse. She was documenting local wildlife for a community college assignment, but she had to work that day. Tyler understood immediately. "Sure, Mrs. Donovan. I could use some fresh air." Jim barely looked up from his newspaper. "Don't stay out too late. Storm's coming in tonight." An hour later, we parked at the small gravel pull-off near the bridge. The summer heat had dried the riverbed considerably since March, expanding the sandbar where I'd seen them. My heart pounded as we walked toward it. "This is where we saw them," I said quietly to Tyler, keeping my voice low so Evan wouldn't hear. He was running ahead, throwing rocks into the water. "Yeah," Tyler nodded, scanning the tree line. "Right there on that sandbar." I took out Chelsea's camera and pretended to photograph birds, but really, I was documenting the location. Snap, the sandbar. Snap, the tree line. Snap, the perspective from where we'd been driving. That's when I smelled it. My nose wrinkled at the sudden stench, like a skunk, but heavier, more muscular. It carried a wild, musky undertone that made my stomach turn. "Mom, what's that smell?" Evan pinched his nose, his face scrunched up in disgust. Tyler's head snapped up. "You smell that too?" The odor grew stronger. With it came something else, a feeling, a pressure in my chest, a certainty that we were being watched. Every maternal instinct in my body screamed danger. "Get to the car," I said, keeping my voice steady but firm. "Now." "But Mom?" "Now, Evan." We walked quickly back to the parking area, not running but not dawdling either. I kept Evan between Tyler and me, my hand on his shoulder. The feeling of being watched intensified with every step. My skin prickled. The hair on my arm stood up despite the July heat. We reached the car, and I fumbled with the keys, dropping them once before managing to unlock the doors. "Get in! Lock your doors!" We piled in, doors locked, windows up. The smell had followed us, somehow seeping into the car despite the closed windows. "What's going on, Mom?" Evan asked, his voice small. "Just being cautious, honey." I turned to look out the windows, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. Nothing visible, at least. "It's watching us," Tyler whispered. "I can feel it." Curiosity battled with fear. I rolled my window down an inch. Immediately the smell hit me full force, along with that overwhelming sense of danger. I rolled it back up. "We're leaving," I announced, starting the engine. No one argued. I backed out of the pull-off faster than was safe, tires spitting gravel. As we drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror. The tree line remained still. But something was there. I knew it with absolute certainty. "Mom, you're driving too fast," Evan said, clutching the seatbelt across his chest. I eased off the gas. "Sorry, honey." We didn't speak again until we were halfway home. Finally, Evan broke the silence. What was that smell? I glanced at Tyler, who gave a slight shake of his head. "Probably just a dead animal, sweetie. Sometimes they smell really bad in the summer heat." It was a lie, but what else could I say? For weeks I kept the incidents to myself. The sighting in March. The smell and feeling of being watched in July. I began researching online, late at night after Jim went to bed. I read about Sasquatch sightings in Montana, Idaho, Washington. Some accounts matched what we had seen. The height, the reddish-brown hair, the way they moved. Others seemed like pure fantasy. The not knowing ate at me. The secret weighed on me. Finally, one night in late August, I couldn't hold it in anymore. We were having dinner, Jim, Chelsea, Evan, Tyler, and me. Jim was talking about a hunting trip he was planning with his buddies. "Thinking of trying that spot near the Clark Fork Bridge," he said, shoveling mashed potatoes into his mouth. "Terry says he's seen some big bucks crossing there at dawn." My fork clattered against my plate. Everyone looked at me. "You don't want to go there," I said. Jim raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" I took a deep breath. "Because there's something in those woods, something not normal." "What do you mean, not normal?" Chelsea asked. Tyler's eyes locked with mine. I could see the question there. Are we really doing this? "Back in March," I started. "When Tyler and I were driving to St. Regis, we saw something on the sandbar by the bridge." "What kind of something?" Jim asked, his voice already tinged with skepticism. "A very large, hairy creature, and a smaller one. They were standing by the water." "A bear and its cub," Jim said dismissively. I shook my head. "No. The big one was standing on 2 legs, 8, maybe 10 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown hair. The small one came up to its knee." "Mom saw it," Tyler confirmed quietly. "I did too." Jim set down his fork. "Kelly, what are you talking about? Bears stand on their hind legs all the time." "It wasn't a bear," I insisted. "And we went back in July, Tyler, Evan, and me. We smelled something terrible, like a skunk, but worse. And I felt watched, threatened." Evan's eyes widened. "That's why we left so fast?" Jim looked at our son. "You smelled something bad?" Evan nodded vigorously. "Super stinky. And Mom got really scared." "I wasn't scared," I lied. "I was cautious." "This is ridiculous." Jim pushed back from the table. "You're talking about Bigfoot in Sanders County? Come on, Kelly." "I know what I saw," I said firmly. "What we saw." Chelsea looked between Tyler and me. You both saw this? For real? Tyler nodded. Yeah. I don't know how to describe it, but it wasn't a bear. Jim stood up. I'm not listening to this nonsense. Next, you'll be telling me about alien abductions. He walked out of the dining room. I heard the back door slam as he went outside to smoke, a habit he'd supposedly quit years ago, but resumed whenever he was stressed. Chelsea leaned forward. Mom, are you serious about this? Completely, I said. I wouldn't make this up. Why didn't you tell us before? Because it sounds crazy. I know it does, but Tyler and I saw what we saw. Tyler nodded again. It was real. Cool, Evan exclaimed. We saw Bigfoot. We don't know what we saw, I corrected him. But it wasn't anything normal. Chelsea still looked skeptical, but less dismissive than her father. What do you think it was doing? I hesitated, then shared the thought that had been growing in my mind for months. I think it was a mother and child. The little one was curious about the ice chunks at the water's edge. The mother was reaching for it, like she was worried it was getting too close to the water. I swallowed hard, like any mother would do. 2 weeks later, I made an official report to a cryptozoology research group. They took my account seriously, asking detailed questions about the sighting, the location, the weather conditions, the behavior of the creatures. They explained that the Clark Fork River Valley had previous reports of similar sightings. The reddish-brown hair is consistent with other accounts from this region, the researcher told me, and the protective behavior you described that tracks with what we understand about these beings. So you believe me? I asked, surprised at how much I needed to hear someone say it. Mrs. Donovan, we've documented over 50 credible sightings in Montana alone. Yours is consistent with patterns we've observed. Jim still won't discuss it. He avoids the subject entirely, changing the topic whenever it comes up. He hasn't gone hunting near the bridge, though, which tells me something. Chelsea is on the fence. She says she believes that I believe it, which isn't quite the same thing as believing me. Tyler and Evan are the only ones who never question what happened. Tyler because he saw them too. Evan because he felt what I felt that day by the river. That primal sense of danger, that certainty of being watched by something powerful and unknown. I've never gone back to that spot. I avoid the bridge entirely now, taking the long way around even when it adds 30 minutes to my drive. But sometimes, especially on bright sunny afternoons in early spring, I think about what I saw. A mother reaching for her child, a child curious about the world around it, familiar actions in unfamiliar forms. What I witnessed that day changed everything I thought I knew about the world, about what exists in the deep forests of Montana, in the spaces between roads and towns and human eyes. There are things out there, families maybe, lives being lived parallel to ours, just out of sight. Every time I drive past a dense stretch of forest now, I wonder. Every unexplained sound in the night makes me think of them. And when I feel that prickle on the back of my neck that tells me I'm being watched, I no longer dismiss it as imagination. Because now I know. They're out there, and they know we're here too. Story 7. I couldn't get my hands to stop shaking. My breathing came in shallow gasps as I fumbled with the binoculars, nearly dropping them in the dirt at my feet. Beside me, Elena clutched my arm, her fingernails digging through my jacket. "Marcus, what is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft, rushing sound of the Flathead River behind us. "That's not... It can't be..." I raised the binoculars to my eyes again, focusing on the hillside about 400 yards away. The creature was still there, moving with a casual, rolling gait across the exposed hillside. The morning light wasn't great, just past 7:30 a.m. on an overcast December day, but visibility was clear enough. "I don't know what it is," I answered truthfully, my throat dry. The binoculars trembled in my grip. We'd been driving to Missoula that morning, December 1st, 2017, just a normal Friday morning trip from our home near the edge of the Flathead Indian Reservation in Sanders County. I'd been behind the wheel, with Elena in the passenger seat, looking through some papers for the meeting she had scheduled later that day. The highway was empty, running parallel to the river, and I'd been enjoying the peaceful quiet of early morning. Then I saw it. Something moving across the hillside to our left. Something that instantly registered as wrong. I'd spent my entire life in these mountains, worked as a Forest Service technician for 15 years, hunted these woods since I was 12, won the Montana State Freestyle Archery Championship 3 years running. I knew every animal that lived in these parts, knew how they moved, their coloration, their habits. This wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. I'd pulled over immediately at a turnout near Old Man Ritter's place. You could always spot it by that white fence he kept meticulously painted. The truck's tires crunched on the gravel as we came to a stop. Now, as we stood watching, the creature continued its purposeful journey across the hillside. It moved from right to left before turning uphill, moving with extraordinary speed. If I hadn't known better, I'd have said it was running, but its movements were too relaxed, too effortless. It was walking, just walking, impossibly fast. "Get your phone," I said to Elena. "Try to take a picture." Elena fumbled in her pocket for her cell phone, her hands shaking as badly as mine. She raised it up, squinting at the screen as she zoomed in as far as the camera would go. "It's too far," she said, frustration in her voice. "And it's moving too fast. I can't get it to focus." Through the binoculars, I could see the creature in much greater detail now. It was uniformly black from head to toe, not the brownish black of a bear, but pure, absolute black, like a hole cut into the landscape. The hillside was covered in tan sagebrush and tall, dried grasses, the vegetation standing 1 to 3 feet high, depending on the spot. The creature's knees just cleared the top of the taller brush, and those arms, Christ, those arms! They swung at its sides as it walked, abnormally long, hanging almost to its knees. Each stride it took was defined, deliberate and impossibly fluid, considering the uneven terrain it navigated. "Look at its hair," I muttered, more to myself than to Elena. The hair on the creature was much longer than a bear's coat, falling in pure black strands that swung with the movement of its arms. Not fur, hair. I couldn't make out a neck. The head seemed to sit directly on broad shoulders, creating a distinctive silhouette against the hillside. "Are you seeing this?" Elena whispered beside me, still struggling with her phone. "Marcus, what is that thing?" "I don't know," I repeated, unable to tear my eyes away from the binoculars. "But it's big, way bigger than a person would look from this distance." The creature continued its journey across the hillside, moving with that same unnerving, easy gait that ate up distance far too quickly. It navigated around rocks and through brush, without slowing, without hesitation, like it had traveled this exact path 1,000 times before. We watched for what felt like hours, but was actually only about 2.5 minutes according to the truck's clock. Then, as abruptly as we'd spotted it, the creature disappeared over the ridge of the hill, vanishing from sight. For several long moments, we stood in silence, staring at the now empty hillside. The only sounds were our breathing, the distant rush of the river, and the occasional car passing on the highway behind us. "Did you get any pictures?" I finally asked, lowering the binoculars. Elena looked down at her phone, flipping through the images she'd captured. "A few, but they're all blurry. It was moving too fast, and it was too far away." She turned the screen toward me, showing a series of grainy, dark smudges against the hillside. Nothing definitive. We climbed back into the truck without another word. I put it in drive and pulled back onto the highway, continuing toward Missoula. Neither of us spoke for at least 10 miles. What was there to say? "We should report it," Elena finally said, breaking the silence. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Report what exactly?" That we saw something on a hillside, we don't even know what it was. You know it wasn't a bear, she said. It wasn't a person, it wasn't an elk or a moose. What else could it have been? I didn't answer. I couldn't. The images of what we'd seen kept replaying in my mind. The fluid, impossibly fast gait, the pure black coloration, those long swinging arms, the absence of a neck, everything about it was wrong, unnatural. That area, I said after another long silence, it's not accessible by road. It's part of the reservation borderlands. Need tribal permission to go in there. Have you ever seen anyone up there before? Hikers? Hunters? I shook my head. Nothing. There's an old cattle trail that cuts through part of it, but it's rough. You'd need horses to navigate it. And there's no reason for anyone to be up there. No good hunting spots, no scenic views, nothing worth the effort. We continued to Missoula in an uneasy silence, both pretending to focus on the day ahead while our minds remained fixed on what we'd witnessed on that hillside. The next 3 days passed in a blur. Elena and I discussed what we'd seen repeatedly, going over every detail, comparing our observations. We searched online for anything similar, using terms like black bipedal creature Montana and tall black figure wilderness sighting. Most results were either about bears, known cryptids like Bigfoot, or clearly fictional accounts. Nothing matched what we'd seen. On December 4th, a heavy snowfall blanketed the entire region, covering the hillside where we'd spotted the creature. Winter had arrived in earnest, transforming the landscape and burying any potential tracks or evidence under feet of snow. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every night, I dreamed of that black figure walking across the hillside, its long arms swinging, moving with that unnatural speed and grace. In my dreams, sometimes it stopped and turned toward me, but I always woke before I could see its face, if it had one. A week after the sighting, I convinced Elena to drive back with me to the spot. The turnout by Old Man Ritter's white fence was plowed clear, probably by the county road crew. We parked and got out, the cold air biting at our faces. The hillside where we'd seen the creature was transformed, covered in pristine white snow that glittered in the winter sunlight. "It looks so different," Elena said, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold. I raised my binoculars and scanned the area carefully. Nothing moved except a few birds in the distance. The snow was undisturbed, no tracks or signs of passage visible even with the magnification. We returned again the following weekend, and the weekend after that. Each time, the hillside remained empty, the snow unmarked by anything larger than rabbit or fox tracks near the base. Despite the clearer winter visibility, we never saw the creature again. Not even common wildlife like deer or elk seemed to frequent that particular hillside, which struck me as strange. In all my years living and working in these mountains, I'd never seen a ridge so devoid of game trails or signs of animal passage. By mid-January, we'd made our trip to the viewing spot something of a ritual, though we no longer expected to see anything. On January 20th, we pulled into the turnout around noon, the day clear and cold. "I talked to my cousin Thomas yesterday," I told Elena as we got out of the truck. Thomas was a member of the tribal council and had grown up on the reservation. Asked him if there were any stories about that hillside. Elena raised an eyebrow. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing specific. Just said I'd been noticing a lack of wildlife in that area and wondered if there was a reason." She waited, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "And?" I leaned against the truck, looking up at the snow-covered hillside. He got real quiet. Then he asked me exactly where I was talking about. When I described this spot, he nodded and said his grandfather used to tell them to stay away from this ridge. "Why?" Elena asked, her voice tense. "The old ones called it the walking place. Said something walks there that isn't human, isn't animal. Something that's been there since before people came to these lands. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, but I didn't think it was from the cold this time. Did he say what it looks like? I nodded slowly. Tall, black, moves faster than a man can run, but it's only walking, arms that hang too low, no neck. I turned to look at her. Sound familiar? She stared up at the hillside, her face pale. Did you tell him what we saw? No, but I think he knew. He told me that his grandfather said if you see it walking, you leave it be. It has a purpose, a path it follows. Has been following it for longer than anyone can remember. They say it's not evil, not good. It just is. What purpose? Elena asked. Where is it going? I shook my head. Thomas wouldn't say more, just that his grandfather told him some questions shouldn't be answered. We stood in silence for a long time, staring up at the empty hillside. Eventually, we got back in the truck and drove home. Over the next few months, we continued our visits to the spot, though less frequently, as winter turned to spring and our normal lives demanded more attention. The snow melted, revealing the tan grasses and sagebrush once again. Still, we saw nothing unusual. By the one-year anniversary of our sighting, our visits had dwindled to once every month or so. Life moved on. We still talked about what we'd seen, still wondered, but the intensity of the experience had faded somewhat with time. It was December 1st, 2018, exactly 1 year after our original sighting. I suggested we make the drive to our viewing spot, more out of sentiment than expectation. The day was similar to the year before, overcast, but with good visibility. We arrived at the turnout near Ritter's White Fence around 7:30 a.m., the same time as our original sighting. Elena and I stood side by side, looking up at the hillside. Nothing moved except the tall grasses swaying in the light breeze. "Do you think we'll ever see it again?" she asked softly. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Part of me hopes we do. Part of me hopes we don't." We waited for 30 minutes, scanning the hillside with binoculars, but saw nothing unusual. Finally, with the temperature dropping and a light snow beginning to fall, we decided to leave. As I turned to open the truck door, Elena grabbed my arm. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice tight with tension. "Look." I turned back toward the hillside, raising the binoculars to my eyes. At first I saw nothing. Then, almost at the exact spot where we'd seen it the year before, a figure emerged from behind a rocky outcropping, pure black, bipedal, moving with that same impossible fluid grace across the uneven terrain. "It's back," I breathed, my heart hammering in my chest. Through the binoculars, I could see it clearly. The long arms swinging at its sides, the absence of a neck, the pure black hair moving with each stride. It followed the same path as before, moving from right to left before turning uphill. This time, Elena had her camera ready. Not her phone, but a digital camera with a powerful zoom lens she'd purchased specifically for this possibility. The shutter clicked rapidly as she captured image after image. We watched in silence as the creature traversed the hillside, moving with that same unnatural speed that was somehow both relaxed and urgent at the same time. After exactly 2.5 minutes, it disappeared over the ridge, just as it had a year before. "Did you get it?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Eleanor nodded, her hands trembling as she reviewed the images on the camera's display. "I think so." She turned the screen toward me. The images were clearer than anything we'd captured before, though still distant and somewhat grainy due to the zoom. But there was no mistaking what they showed. A tall, black figure walking across the hillside, its proportions all wrong for any known animal. We drove home in silence, both processing what we'd just witnessed. The creature had returned to the exact same spot, following the exact same path, on the exact same date and time as our first sighting 1 year later. That night, as we sat at our kitchen table looking through Elena's photographs, She asked the question that had been haunting me all day. "Do you think it'll be back next year? Same day, same time?" I nodded slowly. I think it's been walking that path for longer than we can imagine. Year after year, decade after decade, maybe even century after century, following some purpose we can't understand. "The walking place," Elena murmured, recalling Thomas's words. "Yes," I said, staring at the image on the camera's screen. "And whatever that thing is, it's going to keep walking, whether we're there to see it or not." We never reported our sighting officially. Who would believe us? Instead, we kept the knowledge to ourselves, sharing it only with Thomas, who nodded solemnly when we finally told him what we'd seen. Every December 1st since then, at exactly 7:30 a.m., we returned to that turnout by Ritter's white fence. And every year the Black Walker appears, following its ancient path across the hillside for exactly 2.5 minutes before disappearing over the ridge. Some questions, as Thomas's grandfather said, shouldn't be answered. But that doesn't stop us from asking them. What is it? Where did it come from? Where is it going? And most importantly, why does it return year after year to walk the same path on the same day at the same time? We may never know. All we know for certain is what we've seen with our own eyes. Something walks in the wilderness of Montana that defies explanation. A dark figure moving with impossible grace across a hillside that seems to belong to it more than it belongs to us. And each December 1st it continues its journey to somewhere we can't follow. Story 8. I woke up sweating despite the chill in the air. The damn cancer made sleep nearly impossible most nights, and this October evening was no different. The clock's red digits glared 1:32 a.m. as I swung my legs over the side of the bed, careful not to wake Martha. The bone pain radiated through my hip and down my right leg, but I'd learned to live with it. 3 tours in Afghanistan, and it's cancer that finally got me. Funny how life works. My slippers shuffled against the hardwood as I made my way to the den. Our little farmhouse in the Burke Mountains wasn't much, but it was ours. After 30 years of military service, this quiet piece of North Carolina seemed like heaven, at least until the doctors gave me the news 6 months ago. I settled into my recliner and reached for my Bible on the side table. The familiar leather binding felt good in my hands. I didn't read it as much as I should, but these days I found myself turning to it more and more. The lamp cast a yellow glow across the pages as I thumbed to Psalms. Something comforting about David's words. The house creaked and settled around me. After about 30 minutes of reading, I heard it. A low, shuffling sound outside the window, probably one of Ed Grayson's steers again. That man couldn't keep his fences fixed to save his life, and his cattle were always wandering onto my property. "Damn it," I muttered, dog-earing the page and setting the Bible down. I pushed myself up, grimacing at the pain in my hip. The shotgun was in the closet, but I figured I wouldn't need it. Just had to guide the steer back to Grayson's place and give him an earful in the morning. As I reached for my coat hanging by the door, a commotion erupted from the horse paddock. Thundering hooves and high-pitched whinnies cut through the night. My horses, 3 of them all rescues, never spooked like that. Something was wrong. I moved to the side door off the den that led to the kitchen area and backyard. The exterior light was on, casting a yellowish glow across our property. I reached for the blinds and pulled them back just enough to peek outside. My heart stopped. It wasn't a steer. Standing on my back porch, not 3 feet from the door, was the tallest damn thing I'd ever seen. 7, maybe 8 feet tall. The porch light illuminated it clearly. It had a face like weathered leather, deep-set eyes, and a nose that reminded me of those ancient drawings of Father Time. But this was no fairy tale. Its body was covered in reddish-brown hair, thick and matted in places. Most striking was the ridge of white or blonde hair running from its forehead back, like some prehistoric mohawk. I let the blinds snap shut and stumbled backward. My heart hammered against my ribs. The pain in my hip forgotten, I moved quickly to the drawer where I kept my .357. The cold metal felt reassuring in my palm, but my military instincts kicked in. This situation required more firepower. I made my way down the hall to our bedroom, where Martha was now sitting up, awakened by the commotion. Our two small terriers, Buster and Milo, were going absolutely ballistic, barking and jumping at the bedroom window. "Sam, what's happening?" Martha's voice was tight with fear. "Get dressed," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "and hand me the .44 from the nightstand." To her credit, Martha didn't ask questions. 28 years of marriage to a military man taught her when to move fast. She grabbed the revolver and my .308 rifle from the gun safe. "There's something outside," I said, checking the ammunition. "I've never seen anything like it." "A bear?" she asked, pulling on her robe. I shook my head. "No, ma'am, this ain't no bear." Martha's face went pale. "What do you mean?" "I don't know what it is," I admitted, "but it's big, real big, and it's standing on our back porch." The dogs wouldn't shut up, and the horses were still raising hell outside. I handed Martha the .357. "Stay in here with the dogs. Keep this door locked. I'm going to check things out." "Samuel Whitaker, you are not going out there," Martha said, her voice stern despite the tremble in her hands. "I'm not planning to," I assured her. "Just want to get another look." I moved back down the hallway, the .44 in one hand and the rifle slung over my shoulder. My military training took over, slow, deliberate movements, controlling my breathing. I approached the den window from an angle, careful not to silhouette myself against any interior lights. I eased the curtain back just enough to see outside, and my blood ran cold. There weren't just one of them now, there were four. Two large ones, males I assumed, stood in the yard. One was the creature I'd seen earlier with the white mohawk. The other was slightly smaller but built like a tank. A third, smaller and with a different shape that struck me as female, stood near the edge of the property. And there was a fourth, clearly a juvenile, no taller than 5 feet, but with the same distinctive features. A family. They were a family. As I watched, the largest one, the one I'd seen first, picked up a rock from our decorative garden border and hurled it at the house. It struck the siding with a loud thunk that made me flinch. The horses had fled to the barn up on the hill, their white shapes visible in the distance. Another rock hit the house, then another. They weren't trying to break in. It felt more like they were expressing anger. The oldest one gesticulated wildly, making motions toward the house and then back to the woods. I realized it was probably piss that I'd caught it in the light. For nearly an hour, I watched them move around our property. They never approached the house directly again, but they didn't leave either. The dogs had finally quieted down, exhausted from their barking fit. Martha joined me at the window, the .357 clutched in her hands. "My God," she whispered as the creatures moved across our back pasture. "What are they?" I shook my head. "I don't know." Eventually, around 3:30 a.m., they retreated into the tree line at the edge of our property. I kept watch until dawn, but they didn't return. When the first light broke over the mountains, Martha made coffee while I kept the rifle close. "You think they're gone?" she asked, hands wrapped around her mug. "For now," I said. At 7:30, Ed Grayson's truck rumbled up our driveway. Right behind him was his son, Tyler, in his own pickup. I met them on the front porch, still holding the rifle. "Heard your horses raising hell last night," Ed said by way of greeting. "Everything all right?" I hesitated. Ed was a no-nonsense kind of guy. Ex-logger who'd lived in these mountains his whole life. I wasn't sure he'd believe me. "Found something weird on your property," Tyler said before I could answer. "Bunch of tracks down by the creek that don't look like nothing I've ever seen." I nodded slowly. "We had visitors last night." I led them around to the back of the house, explaining what I'd seen. To my surprise, Ed didn't laugh or dismiss it. His weathered face grew increasingly grim as I described the creatures. "Ain't the first time I heard something like this," he said quietly. "My daddy used to talk about things in these mountains, called them the Watchers, said they mostly kept to themselves unless you bothered them." We followed the obvious path the creatures had taken across our property. The ground was soft from recent rain, and the tracks were unmistakable. Massive footprints, easily 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. They led from our back porch down toward the creek, and then into the dense forest beyond. "Look at this," Tyler called from the horse barn on the hill. The oak wagon wheel Martha had hung as decoration years ago was destroyed. Not just knocked down, but torn apart, the solid oak spokes splintered as if they were toothpicks. It would have taken enormous strength to do that kind of damage. "They were angry," I said, picking up a piece of the shattered wood. "I think I provoked the older one by catching it in the light." We spent the morning checking the property. The horses were skittish but unharmed. Nothing else seemed damaged, but the footprints were everywhere, around the house, by the barn, leading into and out of the woods. A clear trail of their movement. "What are you going to do?" Ed asked as we headed back to the house. "Not much I can do," I replied. "This is their mountain as much as ours." "You could report it," Tyler suggested. I shook my head. "And say what? That Bigfoot and his family paid me a visit? No one would believe it." "More people would than you think," Ed said quietly. "Over the next few weeks the activity remained high around our property. Martha and I would hear heavy footsteps on the porch at night. Sometimes rocks would hit the roof or the side of the house. Never enough to cause damage, just reminders that they were still out there. One morning I found white hair stuck to the top seal of our back door, about 7.5 feet high. Too tall for any human to have left it, and the wrong color and texture for any animal I knew. They began clearing areas in the woods beside our home. I'd find places where the underbrush had been flattened into rough circles, sometimes with stick structures nearby. Figure-8 trails appeared through our back property, worn paths that neither Martha nor I had created. The dogs refused to go out at night anymore. The horses grew accustomed to the visitors, but would still get nervous when the creatures came too close to the barn. Occasionally, a foul odor would drift through the property, like wet dog and skunk mixed with something musty and ancient. Some nights the door handles would rattle. Not violently, more like something, testing them. I kept the guns loaded, but as the weeks passed I became less frightened and more curious. They could have broken in if they wanted to. They were certainly strong enough, but they didn't. One night in early December, I sat in the den reading. The cancer had gotten worse, and the doctors had started me on a new treatment that left me exhausted but unable to sleep. The clock read 2:17 a.m. when I heard a soft thud on the porch. I moved to the window and carefully pulled back the curtain. The oldest one, the one with the white mohawk, stood at the edge of the light, partially hidden by shadows. It seemed to look directly at me, though I couldn't clearly see its eyes. It raised one massive hand, not in threat but almost in acknowledgement, then turned and disappeared into the darkness. The next morning I found a dead rabbit placed carefully on our porch steps. Not mangled or torn apart, just a clean kill. I buried it at the edge of the property. I never told the doctors about our visitors. What was the point? They already thought the cancer might be affecting my brain with all the pain medications I was taking, but Martha saw them too, and Ed, and Tyler. And over time, others in the community started sharing their own stories once word got around about what we'd seen. Jeb Turner, who owned the gas station in town, told me how his grandfather had encountered similar creatures in the 1950s. Sarah Williams, our mail carrier, described finding strange tracks behind her cabin by the river. Even Pastor Mike admitted that his hunting cameras had captured something unusual moving through the woods at night. Something too big to be a bear and walking upright. The creatures retreated deeper into the woods as winter set in, but they never truly left. Sometimes, on particularly bad nights when the pain kept me from sleeping at all, I'd sit on the porch wrapped in blankets and feel their presence in the tree line, watching, waiting, not threatening, just there. The cancer's getting worse now. The doctors don't say it, but I can see it in their eyes. I might not have many more seasons in these mountains. Martha worries about staying here alone after I'm gone, but I tell her she won't be alone. Not really. There's a part of me that takes comfort in knowing there are still mysteries in this world, things that defy explanation, creatures that have managed to remain hidden despite our endless expansion and technology. Last week, I found another rabbit on the porch steps, and beside it, a small arrangement of twigs and leaves that looked almost like a gift. I left it there until the wind took it away. They're still out there, moving through the trees at night, watching our little farmhouse, and sometimes, when the pain is at its worst and the medication isn't helping, I find myself looking toward the woods and wondering if they understand suffering and death as we do. I think they might. I think they understand a lot more than we give them credit for. I haven't told Martha, but when my time comes, I've asked Ed to bury me on our property, at the edge of the woods, where the tracks are most frequent. It seems fitting somehow. After all, we're all just passing through these mountains in the end. Story 9. My hand trembled as I raised the old Remington 870 to my shoulder. The familiar weight of the shotgun should have been comforting, but today it felt like a toy in my hands. The deer hunting season had just started, and I'd returned to Boston County for the first time in 30 years. I hadn't wanted to come back, but my therapist thought it might help me finally process what happened. My name is Jake Mitchell. What Connor Reynolds and I saw in these woods in 1979 changed our lives forever. This is the first time I've told the complete story. The November air bit at my face as I trudged through the fallen leaves, following Connor along the dried creek bed. We were 16, juniors at Boston County High, and had been hunting these woods since we were old enough to hold a rifle. The creek beds around here cut deep into the earth, some with banks towering 20 feet or more above our heads. They fed into the Brazos River eventually, but most stayed dry except during the spring rains. "Think we got time for one more spot before sunset?" Connor asked, checking his watch. His breath made little clouds in the cold air. I squinted at the sky. "Nah, it's already past 4:30. Better head back before it gets dark." Connor nodded and whistled for Rusty, his silver-grey Weimaraner. The dog had been ranging ahead of us, nose to the ground, but he quickly loped back. Connor had gotten Rusty as a puppy 3 years earlier, and that dog was something special, smart as a whip and fearless. I'd seen him chase off coyotes twice his size without hesitation. "Got 2 rabbits and a squirrel. Not bad for a few hours," Connor said, patting the game bag slung over his shoulder. We walked single file along the creek bed, our boots crunching on the dried mud and dead leaves. The banks rose high on either side of us, like walking in a narrow canyon. The good thing about hunting the creek beds was that they acted like natural game trails, channeling animals along predictable paths. The bad thing was that you couldn't see much beyond them. By 5 p.m., the sun hung low on the horizon, right in our faces as we headed west toward home. The golden light made it hard to see details ahead, casting everything in silhouette. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and I zipped my jacket up to my chin. "Probably should have started back sooner," I said. Connor grunted in agreement. "Dad'll be pissed if I'm late for dinner again." Rusty had been trotting ahead of us, occasionally nosing into the brush along the creek banks. But suddenly, he stopped. His ears perked forward, and his body went rigid. "What's he got?" I asked, raising my shotgun instinctively. Connor shook his head. "Don't know." Rusty's behavior shifted from alert to strange in seconds. He began pacing back and forth across the creek bed, making low whining sounds I'd never heard from him before. His tail tucked between his legs, and his head kept swiveling up toward the creek bank ahead of us. "Rusty, heel," Connor commanded, but the dog ignored him completely. Another first. The whining grew louder, more frantic. Rusty circled behind us, then darted forward again, like he couldn't decide whether to run or stay. His whole body trembled. "What the hell's wrong with him?" I asked, my own nerves starting to tingle. Before Connor could answer, Rusty let out a high-pitched yelp and bolted past us, running back the way we'd come. His nails scrambled against the dirt as he disappeared around a bend. "Rusty!" Connor shouted. "Rusty, come back!" I'd never seen the dog run from anything. Not thunderstorms, not bigger dogs, not even Mr. Henson's mean old bull that one time we crossed his pasture as a shortcut. Something was very wrong. As Connor called after his dog, I scanned the area ahead of us. That's when I saw it. About 80 yards away, where the creek made a sharp bend, stood a figure on the rim of the bank. The setting sun behind it turned it into a complete silhouette, black against the orange-red sky. It stood between two large oak trees, perfectly still. My first thought was that it was another hunter, but something felt off immediately. The proportions weren't right. "Connor," I said quietly, nudging him with my elbow. "Look up there." He stopped calling for Rusty and followed my gaze. "Who's that?" "Don't know. Maybe someone hunting from the ridge?" The figure hadn't moved at all. It just stood there watching us. I raised my arm and waved. "Hey there!" I called out. No response, no wave back, no movement at all. "Maybe they didn't see us," Connor suggested, but his voice had gone tight. I waved again, more vigorously this time. "Hello! You hunting?" The sun dipped lower, making it harder to see details, but I could tell the figure was unusually tall, really tall and broad. It stood perfectly straight, arms at its sides. Then it moved. The movement wasn't like a person's. It was too smooth, too deliberate. The figure stepped sideways behind one of the oak trees, disappearing from view. "He's moving around the tree," I said, keeping my eyes fixed on the spot. We waited for the figure to emerge on the other side of the tree. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. Nothing. "Where'd he go?" Connor asked, his voice barely above a whisper now. I squinted hard, trying to see better against the setting sun. "I don't know. Should have come out the other side by now." There was nothing behind those trees except open field. Nowhere to hide. But the figure was gone. A cold feeling washed over me that had nothing to do with the November air. I took an involuntary step backward. "Connor, did you see how tall that was?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, too tall." "Let's go find Rusty and get out of here," I said, my mouth suddenly dry. We didn't run, not at first. Something told me not to show fear. We backed up slowly, eyes fixed on that tree line. When we'd gone about 20 yards, we turned and hurried down the creek bed the way we'd come. "What about Rusty?" Connor asked, his breath coming faster now. "He probably ran home. He knows the way." We reached a spot where the creek bank sloped down enough that we could scramble out. Without discussing it, we both knew we didn't want to stay in that creek bed any longer. I went first, digging my boots into the soft dirt, using roots as handholds to pull myself up. Connor followed right behind me. Once on level ground, we had a clear view all around us. Fields stretched toward the Rogers farm to the south, and Connor's place about a half-mile to the east. The woods continued to the north and west. "See anything?" Connor asked, spinning in a circle, shotgun held ready. I scanned the tree line. No, nothing. We set off across the open field toward Connor's house, walking fast. After about 100 yards, we both broke into a run without saying a word. The shotguns bounced against our backs, our game bags slapping against our hips. Connor's house came into view just as the last light was fading from the sky. A yellow porch light glowed like a beacon. We slowed to a walk as we approached, not wanting his parents to see us running scared. "Rusty!" Connor called out as we entered the yard. "Here, boy!" No answering bark, no pattering of paws on the grass. "He's got to be here somewhere," I said, trying to sound confident. Connor circled the house, calling for his dog. I followed, eyes constantly checking the darkness beyond the yard. We completed a full loop with no sign of Rusty. "Check under the porch," I suggested. Connor knelt down and peered into the darkness beneath his house. "Rusty, you in there, boy?" A low whine answered him. "He's here." Connor dropped to his hands and knees and crawled toward the sound. "Come on, Rusty, come out." Another whine, but no movement. I knelt down beside Connor and switched on my flashlight. The beam caught two reflective eyes far under the house, near the center foundation pillar. Rusty was pressed flat against the ground, as far from the edges as he could get. "What's wrong with him?" I whispered. Connor shook his head. "I've never seen him like this. Rusty, come!" The dog just trembled and whined. Connor's dad came out onto the porch, screen door slapping shut behind him. "You boys finally back? Dinner's getting cold." "Dad, something's wrong with Rusty," Connor called back. "He's hiding under the house and won't come out." Mr. Reynolds came down the steps, boots heavy on the wood. He was a big man, a former linebacker who still looked like he could tackle someone if needed. "What'd you do to that dog?" he asked, crouching down beside us. "Nothing," Connor protested. "We were coming back along Miller Creek when he just freaked out and ran off." Mr. Reynolds frowned and took the flashlight from me, shining it under the house. "Rusty, come here, boy." Even Connor's dad couldn't get Rusty to budge. After 10 minutes of coaxing, Mr. Reynolds went to the shed and came back with a long-handled rake. He had to literally drag Rusty out from under the house, the dog fighting him the whole way. When Rusty finally emerged, his state shocked us all. His fur was matted with dirt and sweat, his eyes wide and rolling. He panted heavily, and every muscle in his body seemed to be trembling. When Connor tried to pet him, Rusty flinched away. "What in God's name spooked him like this?" Mr. Reynolds asked, looking from the dog to us. Connor glanced at me, and I gave a small shake of my head. Something told me not to mention what we'd seen. Not yet. "Don't know," Connor said. "Maybe a cougar or something?" His dad looked skeptical. "Rusty's chased off coyotes before. Never seen him scared of anything." We brought Rusty inside, but he wouldn't eat his dinner. He spent the whole night huddled in the corner of the kitchen, jumping at every sound. I called my parents to say I was staying over at Connor's, and we stayed up late whispering about what we'd seen. "What do you think it was?" Connor asked, his voice barely audible in the darkness of his bedroom. I stared at the ceiling. "I don't know. A person? Maybe some really tall guy playing a joke?" "No way that was a person, Connor. Did you see how tall it was?" We fell silent, remembering. I was 5'11" then, and judging by the trees and the height of the bank, whatever we saw had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. And broad, too, not just tall but massive. "How did it disappear like that?" Connor whispered. I had no answer. The next morning, we went back. I'm not sure why. Curiosity, maybe, or the need to prove to ourselves that there was a rational explanation. We took our shotguns, and Rusty absolutely refused to come with us, no matter how much Connor called him. We approached the creek from a different angle, coming in from the field side rather than walking along the bed. The daylight gave us confidence we'd lacked the evening before. When we reached the spot where we'd seen the figure, we found nothing unusual. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing to suggest anyone or anything had stood there. The 2 oak trees were about 10 feet apart, their trunks thick and gnarled with age. "Could it have climbed the tree?" Connor suggested. We examined both trees, but found no claw marks or broken limbs that would indicate something large had climbed them. "Makes no sense," I muttered. For the next hour, we searched the surrounding area in ever-widening circles. Nothing. Eventually we gave up and headed back, more confused than ever. Rusty never fully recovered from whatever had frightened him. The once fearless dog became nervous in the dark, refused to go near that part of the property, and would bark frantically at shadows. Connor's parents eventually assumed he'd had a run-in with a mountain lion, though no one had reported seeing one in the area for years. We kept hunting that season, but we stayed away from that particular creek bed. Sometimes, in the distance, we'd hear strange sounds coming from deep in the woods, not quite animal, not quite human. A sort of wood-knocking sound, or occasionally what sounded like a distant low whistle. Once, about 2 weeks after our encounter, we found enormous tracks in mud near Henson Creek, about a mile from our original sighting. They were roughly human-shaped but much larger, at least 16 inches long, and the stride length was well over 5 feet. We tried to make plaster casts like we'd seen in a detective show, but they didn't turn out well. By Christmas break, we'd convinced ourselves it must have been some kind of freak incident. Maybe the figure was just a hunter in dark clothes, standing on something that made him appear taller. Maybe the sun playing tricks on our eyes made it seem to disappear. Maybe Rusty had encountered something else entirely that scared him, but deep down, I knew better. Whatever we saw that November afternoon wasn't a hunter, wasn't a person at all. In my nightmares, which came frequently that winter, I always saw it step behind the tree and simply cease to exist, as though it had slipped into some crack in the world that I couldn't see. Connor and I never told anyone else the full story. Who would believe us? We got tired of people suggesting rational explanations that we'd already considered and dismissed. Eventually, we stopped talking about it even with each other, though I know it haunted him as much as it did me. After high school, I left Boston County for college and never moved back. Connor stayed, took over his family's feed store, got married, had kids. We kept in touch sporadically, but neither of us ever mentioned that day, until last year when Connor called me out of the blue. "Jake," he said, his voice tense, "it's happening again." My blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" "My son and his friend. They were fishing along Miller Creek yesterday evening. They saw something." I gripped the phone tighter. "What did they see?" "A tall figure watching them from the bank. They said it followed them for a while, always staying just at the edge of the woods. When they tried to get a closer look, it was gone." I didn't know what to say. "Jake, they're scared, really scared, and I don't know what to tell them, because I still don't know what we saw that day." Neither did I, and as I stand here now, 30 years later, shotgun in hand, staring down into the same creek bed where it all happened, I still don't have answers. Just a lingering fear and the certainty that whatever watched us that day is still out there, still waiting in the woods of Boston County. I take a deep breath and begin my descent into the creek bed, determined to face what we ran from all those years ago. The shadows are lengthening. It'll be sunset soon. Story 10. I was 5 years old when it happened, summer of 1983. The air hung thick and warm in our small house in Rusk County, Texas, the kind of evening heat that sticks to your skin. The ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, barely moving the air around the living room where I sat cross-legged on the brown shag carpet. My collection of Hot Wheels cars was spread out before me. I remember lining them up in rows, making engine noises with my mouth as Bob Barker's voice called out prices on the television. The Price is Right was on, but I wasn't really watching. I was more focused on racing my red Camaro against a blue Mustang, creating my own championship on the carpet racetrack of my imagination. Grandpa Wallace was on the couch behind me. He'd been in a bad car accident 3 weeks earlier. Pickup truck versus 18-wheeler, the pickup losing badly. His neck was in one of those metal contraptions, a halo brace they called it, with screws going right into his skull to keep everything still while he healed. It looked like torture, but he never complained. He'd fallen asleep watching TV with me, his mouth hanging open slightly, soft snores occasionally rising above the television sounds. Through the open doorway to the dining room, I could hear Mom, Grandma, and Mrs. Ledbetter from next door playing cards. The slap of cards on the table and their occasional laughter formed the backdrop to my play. The front door was wide open, with just the screen door closed to keep the bugs out while letting whatever breeze might come through. That's how we did things back then. Doors open, neighbors dropping by unannounced, kids playing until the streetlights came on. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in oranges and reds. I remember that because the light coming through the screen door had that golden quality, the kind that makes everything look special for just a little while before darkness takes over. I was pushing my favorite car, a silver Corvette with red stripes, along the edge of the coffee table when I felt something. Not heard, not saw, felt, like when someone's looking at you and you just know it. I glanced up at the screen door and froze. There was somebody, something, standing on our porch right outside the door. At first I thought it might be one of the Johnson kids from down the street, maybe playing a prank. But this wasn't a kid. It wasn't an adult either. The creature, because that's what it was, stood about 4 feet tall, just a bit taller than me. It was covered in reddish-brown fur that looked coarse and thick, especially around its broad shoulders. Its face was flatter than a person's, with a short snout, but not as flat as a monkey's face I'd seen in my picture books. We stared at each other. I wasn't scared. That's the strangest part looking back. I should have been terrified, but I wasn't. There was something in its eyes. They were dark and round, but alive with intelligence. They weren't animal eyes, not exactly. They looked curious. I stood up, still clutching my silver Corvette. The creature's gaze dropped to my hand, focusing on the toy car, its head tilted slightly like my dog Rusty did when he was trying to understand something. Slowly I walked toward the screen door. The floorboards creaked under my feet, but Grandpa didn't stir. The creature didn't move either, just watched me approach. When I reached the door, I was close enough to see its chest rise and fall with breath. Close enough to notice its hands. Not paws, but hands with fingers and opposable thumbs hanging at its sides. There was a smell, but it wasn't strong or unpleasant, just different. Kind of like when Rusty came in from the rain, but earthier. I held up my Corvette, pressing it against the screen. The creature leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the toy. We stayed like that for maybe 30 seconds, though it felt longer, just looking at each other through the thin mesh of the screen door. It never made a sound, neither did I. Then I got excited. I wanted to show Mom and Grandma. I turned and ran to the kitchen, the Corvette still clutched in my hand. "Grandma! Grandma!" I called out, tugging at her sleeve. "There's somebody outside. Come see." Grandma looked down at me, annoyed at the interruption. "Tommy Wallace, what are you going on about now? There's a monkey or something on the porch. Come see, come see." Mom and Mrs. Ledbetter laughed, but Grandma sighed and put down her cards. "All right, Tommy, let's go see this monkey of yours." I pulled her by the hand back to the living room, practically bouncing with excitement. "Look, at the door!" But the porch was empty. The golden light had faded to purple dusk, and there was nothing there but the old rocking chair and Mum's potted geraniums. "See what?" Grandma asked. Her voice edged with impatience. It was there, a furry thing like a little monkey but bigger. It was looking at my cars. Grandma's face softened, but not in the way I wanted. It was that adult face they make when they think you're being silly. "Tommy, don't make up stories. You probably saw a raccoon or the neighbor's cat." "It wasn't a raccoon. It was standing up like a person." Mrs. Ledbetter had followed us in. "Sounds like Bigfoot to me," she said with a laugh. "Sasquatch in Russ County. Now I've heard everything," Mom chuckled, putting her hand on my head. "Come on, Tommy, it's almost bedtime." "But it was real," I insisted, my excitement turning to frustration. "It was right there." "Tommy Wallace," Grandma said firmly. "That's enough imagination for one night. Go wash up for bed." I looked back at the screen door one more time, hoping my visitor might return to prove me right. But there was nothing there except the gathering darkness. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those eyes looking at me, the way they had followed my toy car. I made a decision then, lying in my bed with the sheets pulled up to my chin. If the creature liked my car so much, it should have it. The next morning I woke up early. The house was still quiet. I tiptoed to my toy box and took out the silver Corvette. I clutched it in my hand as I snuck through the living room where Grandpa was still sleeping on the couch. He couldn't lie in a bed with that metal thing on his head. I carefully unlatched the screen door, wincing at the slight squeak of the spring. The morning air was already warm, promising another hot Texas day. Dew dampened my pajama bottoms as I walked into the yard. I looked around, hoping to see my visitor, but the yard was empty. I went to the edge of the porch and placed the Corvette on the ground, right where I figured the creature had been standing. I patted it once, like saying goodbye to a friend, then went back inside for breakfast. After pancakes, I rushed outside to check if the car was still there. It wasn't. I searched all around the porch, under the steps, in the grass nearby. My silver Corvette with the red stripes was gone. "Mom! Mom!" I called, running back inside. "It took my car." "What took your car, honey?" Mom asked, washing syrup off Grandpa's plate. "The monkey thing from last night. My Corvette is gone," Mom sighed. "Tommy, you probably just lost it in the yard. We'll look for it later. But I put it right by the steps for him, and now it's gone." "Tommy Wallace!" Grandma cut in from the living room. "What did I say about making up stories?" I fell silent. They weren't going to believe me. That much was clear. We never found that Corvette. I looked for weeks, checking every inch of the yard, even the neighbors' yards. It had vanished as completely as my visitor. Years passed. I grew up, graduated high school, went to community college. The incident faded to the background, filed away with other childhood memories, but it never completely left me. When I was 22, I took a Texas folklore class as an elective. The professor, Dr. Simmons, mentioned regional cryptids one day, legendary creatures reported in different areas. He brought up Sasquatch sightings in East Texas, showing blurry photographs and plaster casts of footprints. While the Pacific Northwest is more famous for Sasquatch encounters, he said, Texas has its share of reports, particularly in the eastern piney woods. Native American tribes like the Caddo have stories of wild men in the forests that predate European settlement. I sat up straight in my chair. The descriptions matched what I'd seen. The reddish-brown fur, the flat face, the intelligence in the eyes. After class, I approached Dr. Simmons and told him my story. I expected ridicule, but he listened intently. "What's particularly interesting," he said when I finished, "is that you describe what sounds like a juvenile Sasquatch. Most fabricated accounts feature full-grown specimens, and the curiosity about human artifacts, especially mechanical things like vehicles, appears in many credible reports." That conversation led me down a rabbit hole of research. I read everything I could find on Sasquatch encounters. I joined online forums, attended cryptozoology conferences, even participated in a few weekend expeditions in the piney woods with other believers. Some accounts matched elements of my experience so closely it sent chills down my spine. The curious nature, the interest in human objects, the intelligence in the eyes that seemed more than animal but not quite human. Of course, I faced skepticism, lots of it. My college roommates laughed at my Sasquatch obsession. Girls I dated found it quirky at first, then increasingly weird as they realized I was serious. My mom still insists I saw a raccoon or feral dog. Grandma took her disbelief to the grave. Only Grandpa ever gave me the benefit of the doubt. Years after that night when I was in high school and his halo brace was long gone, he mentioned it. "You know, Tommy," he said as we fished at Lake Henderson one evening, "I wasn't completely asleep that night." "What night?" I asked, focused on baiting my hook. "The night you saw your visitor." He cast his line into the water with practiced ease. "I heard you talking to something at the door. Opened my eyes just a crack. Couldn't turn my head with that damn contraption. But I saw you standing there at the screen holding up that toy car of yours." My hands froze. "You saw it?" He reeled in a bit, adjusting his line. "Didn't see what was on the other side of that screen. My angle was wrong. But I saw you, clear as day, acting like you were showing your toy to somebody. And you weren't a boy for making things up, Tommy. Never were." That was as close as I ever got to validation from my family. Last year, I returned to my old hometown. The house is gone now, torn down after Grandpa passed to make way for a gas station. I stood in what would have been the front yard, trying to reimagine where the porch had been, where I had stood with my silver Corvette held up to the screen. There's woods about a quarter-mile behind, where our house used to stand. They're scheduled to be cleared for a shopping centre next spring. Standing there on the cracked pavement, I wondered if my visitor came from those woods. I wondered if any of its kind still lived there, watching as their habitat shrinks year by year. I'm 45 now. I've got kids of my own, a mortgage, a job selling insurance. To most people who know me, I'm perfectly ordinary. They don't know about the box in my closet filled with Sasquatch research, the weekend trips I still occasionally take to reported sighting locations, or how I still sometimes wake up remembering those intelligent eyes studying me through the screen door. Some nights, I sit on my porch with a toy car placed on the steps, just in case. My wife thinks it's silly but harmless. My children used to think it was one of Dad's weird habits, but now my oldest has started asking questions, showing interest. I don't expect another encounter. Lightning rarely strikes twice, but I know what I saw that summer evening in 1983. It wasn't a raccoon or a dog or a neighbor kid in a costume. It wasn't my imagination. It was real. Those eyes were real. That moment of connection was real. And somewhere out there, maybe there's a middle-aged Sasquatch with a silver Corvette with red stripes, remembering the human child who gave him a gift one summer morning long ago. Whether anyone believes me or not, that's what happened. Some truths don't need validation to remain true. They just are. Story 11. The weight of the deer rifle felt good in my hands as I made my way through the familiar woods of the old Berry farm. November in Texas can be tricky. Sometimes warm enough for just a flannel, other times cold enough to see your breath. That day in 1986 was somewhere in between, with a crisp chill that kept me alert as the afternoon light filtered through the bare branches overhead. "Remember, Jimmy, stay put until I come get you," I told my nephew, watching as he climbed up into the deer stand we'd picked out. He was 14 and eager to bag his first buck. These woods can get confusing at dusk. "I know, Uncle Martin," Jimmy said, rolling his eyes the way teenagers do. "You've only told me 3 times now." I chuckled and tousled his hair. "That's because your aunt would skin me alive if I lost you out here. I'll be about half a mile that way." I pointed toward my usual spot near the creek bottom. "Should be back for you around 5:30. Jimmy nodded, already settling in with his rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the clearing ahead of his position. I'd been hunting these woods since I was younger than Jimmy. My daddy brought me here first when I was maybe 10 years old, and I'd walked every acre of the Berry farm in the 30 years since. The land stretched out behind Maud, mostly forgotten, except by locals who knew its value during deer season. I felt at home here, knew every game trail, every creek bend, every patch of brush thick enough to hide a 12-point buck. My stand overlooked a natural funnel where deer often traveled between feeding areas. For 3 hours, I sat motionless, watching, waiting. shot a decent 8-pointer around 4, field dressed him quickly, and hung the carcass from a nearby tree to collect on our way out. That buck meant venison steaks for weeks, but I still had some time before I needed to collect Jimmy, so I decided to walk the creek bottom toward his position. The light was fading fast as I moved quietly through the woods. The creek bottom ran into a large swamp thicket that bordered the lake on the east side of the property. It was an area I knew well, though I rarely hunted it directly, too wet and muddy to be comfortable. I was maybe a quarter mile from Jimmy's stand when the smell hit me. It wasn't the usual swamp smell of mud and rotting vegetation. This was something else entirely, a putrid, foul odor that reminded me of roadkill left in the summer sun for a week. The stench was so strong it made my eyes water. I paused, lifting my rifle instinctively as I scanned the thicket to my right. That's when I heard it. Something moving through the water, not the delicate steps of a deer or even the deliberate stalking of a wild hog. This sounded heavier, more like a person sloshing through knee-deep water. My first thought was that Jimmy had abandoned his stand early, maybe gotten bored or spooked. "Jimmy?" I called out, not too loud but enough to carry. "That you, boy?" The movement in the thicket stopped immediately. Dead silence followed, not even the usual evening birds making noise. Then whatever was in there started moving again, but now it was moving away from me, faster than before. Much faster. I followed along the edge of the thicket, trying to keep pace. The brush was thick, but occasionally thin enough to see glimpses of movement through the tangle of branches and vines. Something big was definitely in there. About 50 yards down, the thicket opened into a small clearing, maybe 30 feet across. The water there was shallow but murky, with patches of higher ground dotted throughout. I stopped at the edge, rifle ready, and waited. What happened next is something I've replayed in my mind 1,000 times since that day. It burst from the thicket on the opposite side and crossed that clearing in 5, maybe 6 strides. My brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing at first. The thing was massive, standing at least 6, maybe 7 feet tall. It walked on 2 legs like a man, but hunched forward slightly. Every inch of it was covered in dark brown hair, thick and matted in some places, especially around the shoulders and back. I've field-dressed enough deer to know what different animals weigh. This thing was easily 350, maybe 400 pounds of solid mass. Despite its size, it moved with surprising speed and agility through the knee-deep sludgy water, barely slowing as it crossed the clearing. I only saw it for maybe 30 seconds total, and mostly from behind as it moved away from me. The head was rounded but slightly pointed at the top. The shoulders were impossibly broad, tapering to a narrower waist. The arms hung longer than a man's would, swinging with each stride. Not once did it turn to look at me, though it had to know I was there. It just kept moving, disappearing into the thicker brush on the far side of the clearing. I stood frozen for several minutes after it was gone. My heart hammered in my chest so hard I could feel each beat in my throat. My hands were shaking on my rifle, which I realized I'd never even raised to my shoulder. The stench lingered in the air, that unmistakable putrid smell. Eventually, my senses returned. The sun was nearly gone now, and I needed to get Jimmy. I backtracked quickly, no longer concerned with being quiet, moving at a near run until I reached the main trail that led to Jimmy's stand. "You see anything, Uncle Martin?" Jimmy called down as I approached. "Time to go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Come on down now." "But it's barely dark," he protested. "Dad lets me stay out until full dark." "We're leaving now, Jimmy." My tone left no room for argument. He climbed down, clearly disappointed. "Did you at least get something? I didn't see a single deer all afternoon." "Got an 8-pointer earlier. We'll grab him on the way out." I was already walking, forcing Jimmy to jog to catch up. "You okay, Uncle Martin? You look like you've seen a ghost or something." I glanced at him, considering how much to say. "Did you hear anything strange while you were sitting, or smell anything unusual?" Jimmy shook his head. Just some squirrels and a raccoon. Why? No reason, I said, picking up the pace. Let's get that deer and head back to the truck. We collected my buck and made it back to the truck just as full darkness settled over the woods. I didn't relax until we were on the highway, heading back toward town, the headlights cutting through the darkness, the radio playing some Merle Haggard song I wasn't really hearing. That night, after dropping Jimmy off with a promise not to tell his mother he'd seen nothing, I sat alone at my kitchen table with a glass of whiskey. The encounter kept replaying in my mind. What I'd seen didn't make sense, didn't fit into the world as I understood it. The thing is, it wasn't the first time I'd heard about something strange in those woods. My daddy used to tell a story about hunting there in the early 60s. He and two buddies had brought dogs, good hunting dogs trained to track deer. Halfway through the day, the dogs had come tearing back to them, tails tucked, whining and refusing to go any further into the woods. Minutes later, they'd all heard screaming. Not like anything human, Daddy said. They'd left immediately. I'd always dismissed that story as my daddy trying to spook me. Same with old man Clarence Jenkins, who swore something had attacked his hunting party back in '72, knocked two men down and taken one of their dogs. Everyone in town had written Clarence off as a drunk with an overactive imagination. Now I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I called my sister Linda. Her place backed up to the Berry Farm property on the north side. "You ever notice anything strange around your place?" I asked after some small talk. "Strange how?" Linda sounded distracted, probably dealing with breakfast for her kids. "I don't know. Unusual noises at night? Problems with your livestock? Anything like that?" There was a pause on the line. "Why are you asking, Martin?" "Just curious." Another long pause. "Well, now that you mention it, about 3 months ago, something tore down our back gate. Tom figured it was teenagers or maybe a drunk driver, but it was pulled clean off the hinges." "That all?" "No." Her voice dropped lower. "We found 2 of our hogs dead the next morning. Big ones too, nearly 200 pounds each. Whatever killed them didn't eat them, just tore them open. Deep gashes like knife wounds, but bigger." My stomach tightened. "You called the sheriff?" "Tom did. They said probably a bear, but there haven't been bears around here in 50 years. Linda paused again. "Our German shepherd hid under the bed for 2 days after. Wouldn't come out for nothing. What's this about, Martin?" "Just heard some stories," I said vaguely. "Thought I'd ask around." After hanging up with Linda, I made more calls. Cousin Bill, who lived over by the lake, had heard screaming sounds 3 nights in a row last spring. Like a woman being murdered, but not quite human, he described it. Uncle Ray found footprints by his chicken coop. Biggest damn tracks I ever saw, shaped like a man's but twice the size. Old Mrs. Whitley lost 3 calves in one night last winter, found them with their necks broken but otherwise untouched. All these stories, all these years, and I'd never paid them any mind. Figured they were exaggerations, misidentifications, or just plain lies. Now I knew better. I'd seen it with my own eyes. I didn't go back to the Berry Farm that hunting season. Told Jimmy I was down with a bad back, which wasn't entirely a lie. The tension from that encounter had knotted my muscles so bad I could barely turn my head for a week. When he asked if he could go with his dad instead, I nearly said no before catching myself. Whatever was in those woods hadn't shown any interest in hurting humans, far as I knew. Still, I made sure to tell my brother-in-law to keep Jimmy close and to be out of the woods well before dark. Winter came and went. By spring, I'd almost convinced myself I'd seen a bear, a very large, upright walking bear with a strange gait and an unnatural silhouette. The human mind plays tricks, especially in low light. That's what I told myself. Then in April, Tom called me. "You asked Linda about strange things happening on our property," he said without preamble. "Well, it happened again. Something killed one of our dogs last night, broke its neck, and left it by the back porch." "You see anything?" I asked. that familiar tightness returning to my chest. No, but I heard it, moving around outside the house around midnight. Heavy footsteps, breaking branches. Thought it was a person at first, grabbed my shotgun and went to the window. Tom paused. Then it screamed, Martin. Jesus Christ, I never heard anything like it. Not animal, not human, something in between. You call the sheriff? Tom laughed, a short, harsh sound. And tell him what? That Bigfoot killed my dog? They'd have me committed. Bigfoot. The word hung in the air between us, even over the phone line. Neither of us had said it before, but there it was. You don't believe in that stuff, do you, Tom? I asked carefully. Another pause. I didn't. Now I'm not so sure. Linda said you were asking questions for a reason. You see something out there, Martin? I took a deep breath. Last November, in the swamp thicket by the creek bottom at the Berry farm. Something big, walking on two legs, covered in hair. Jesus, Tom whispered. You think there's more than one? The thought hadn't occurred to me, and it sent a chill down my spine. I don't know. Maybe. What do we do? Nothing, I said firmly. We keep our eyes open, we stay out of those woods at night, and we don't go telling stories that'll get us laughed out of the county. Tom agreed, and that's exactly what we did. For the next few months, we gathered information quietly. More stories emerged, always at the edges of conversations, told hesitantly by people who prefaced them with, "You'll think I'm crazy," but sightings going back decades, strange encounters, unexplained livestock deaths, unusual tracks. I went back to the Berry farm once that summer in broad daylight with Tom and my hunting rifle. We found nothing concrete, no footprints, no hair samples, nothing that would convince a skeptic. But the swamp thicket still reeked of that same putrid smell in certain spots, and neither of us ventured far into it. When November came around again, and Jimmy asked about our annual hunting trip, I took him to a different spot 30 miles away. I still hunt deer every season, but I've never gone back to the Berry farm. Some places, you don't belong. Some things you're not meant to understand. I know what I saw that day in 1986. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a man in a suit, and it wasn't my imagination. It was something that shouldn't exist according to science and reason, but exists nonetheless. A creature that's managed to stay hidden in the dark corners of East Texas, occasionally seen but rarely reported by people who value their reputations. I've never told this story publicly before. Most folks would think I'm crazy or lying. But I know what I saw crossing that clearing in 5 long strides. I know what made those footprints and killed those animals. I know what screamed in the night outside Tom and Linda's place. And I know enough to stay away from the swamp thicket by the creek bottom at the old Berry farm, especially when the light is fading and the shadows grow long. Story 12. I never believed in monsters. Not the ones they show on TV or in the movies anyway, but I'm Sean McLean, and what happened to me and my family on Westview Road in Cambridge, Ohio back in the early 90s changed all that, changed everything really. We'd moved into that double-wide trailer just before summer in 91. Nothing fancy, but it was home. Me and my 3 brothers shared one side of the place while Mum and Dad took the master on the other end. The property backed up against a thick stretch of woods with a creek running through it. Perfect place for boys to explore and get into the kind of mischief that keeps mothers up at night. The first strange thing happened about 2 months after we settled in. Me and my brothers were up late, probably when we shouldn't have been, watching some old horror flick on the fuzzy TV we had in our bedroom. The volume was turned way down so we wouldn't wake Dad. He had early shifts and a temper to match if he didn't get his sleep. It started with a sound outside our window, a heavy, deliberate thump, then another and another. "What's that?" my youngest brother whispered. "Probably just a raccoon," I said, though raccoons don't usually make the ground vibrate when they walk. The footsteps continued, slow and measured, moving along the side of our trailer. The bedroom window faced the woods, and whatever was out there was making its way from the back of the property toward the front. Each step seemed heavier than the last. Then the shuffling started, a sound of something large dragging against the aluminum siding of our home. My bed was against the wall, and I could feel a slight vibration coming through. Something was out there, running its hand or paw or whatever along our house. We all sat frozen, staring at the window. The old trailer curtains were thin, but closed, thank God. None of us dared to look. The footsteps stopped right outside our window. I could hear breathing now, deep, huffing breaths that fogged the glass. I grabbed my brother's arm so tight he winced. We didn't move, didn't breathe, just waited. Then it happened. A tremendous boom shook our entire trailer. We were knocked sideways as the whole structure shifted. Picture frames crashed to the floor. Our TV tumbled off its stand. The lights flickered. Our door flew open as Dad came charging down the hallway in his underwear. "What the hell was that?" he shouted. We didn't know. None of us knew. But when morning came, we discovered our trailer had been knocked clean off its foundation on one side. Dad figured it was just the ground settling or something, but we knew better. Something had pushed our home. Something strong. Life went back to normal for a few weeks after that. We explored the woods, swam in the creek, did all the normal kid stuff. But I started noticing things. Trees with broken branches, way higher up than any person could reach. Strange arrangements of rocks by the creek. Weird nest-like structures made of branches and leaves. I didn't tell anyone, not even my brothers. Then came the night that changed everything. It was close to 10:30, and the whole family was in the living room playing cards. Mum had made hot chocolate, and for once all of us kids were getting along. I remember it clearly because everything was so normal, so peaceful before it happened. I got up to use the bathroom and glanced out the window on my way back. The porch light was on, casting a yellow glow into our front yard. And there it was. Crouched down near our car was the biggest creature I'd ever seen. Dark, covered in hair, with broad shoulders hunched forward. It was looking directly at our house. No, not at our house. At me. Through the window. At me. I froze. My whole body went cold. The thing and I locked eyes for what felt like forever, but was probably just seconds. Its face was almost human, but not. The brow was heavy, the nose flat and wide, and the eyes reflected the porch light with an eerie glow. "Dad," I managed to whisper, not taking my eyes off the window. "Dad, there's something outside." "What are you talking about, Sean?" he said, not looking up from his cards. "There's someone outside the window," I said, my voice cracking. Dad sighed and got up, clearly annoyed. He walked over to where I stood, looked out the window, and his entire body went rigid. The color drained from his face. "Everyone stay inside," he said in a voice I'd never heard before. He went to the closet and pulled out his shotgun. By then, the creature had vanished into the darkness. Dad went outside with his gun and a flashlight, but found nothing. He said I'd probably just seen a bear, though we'd never had bears in that part of Ohio. We all knew it wasn't a bear. Nobody slept that night. The very next evening, around the same time, we heard noises outside again. Shuffling, heavy footsteps, wood cracking. This time, all of us heard it. Dad grabbed his gun again, and despite Mum's protests, went to the front door. We all followed, standing behind him in a frightened cluster. He yanked the door open, shotgun raised, and there it was. Standing not 20 feet from our front steps was a massive hair-covered creature. It was standing upright like a man, but it was huge, its head reaching almost to the height of our roof. It had to be 8, maybe 9 feet tall. In the porch light, we could see its dark brown fur covering massive muscles. Steam rose from its body in the cool night air. None of us moved. None of us breathed. The creature stared at us, and we stared back. I could smell it now, a musky, wild animal smell mixed with something like wet dog. Dad's shotgun trembled in his hands. He later told us he couldn't bring himself to shoot. It looked too human, despite being clearly not human at all. After what seemed like an eternity, the creature made a low, rumbling sound in its chest, turned, and with two massive strides, disappeared into the tree line. Its movement was fluid, powerful, nothing like a person in a costume. Dad slammed the door and locked it. Mum was crying. My younger brothers were in shock. We pushed the couch against the door that night and kept all the lights on till morning. We didn't talk about it the next day, or the day after. It was like we all silently agreed that if we didn't talk about it, maybe it wasn't real. Maybe it would go away. It didn't. About a week later, around midnight, something started hitting our roof. At first we thought it was hail, but the sky was clear. Then we realized rocks. Someone or something was throwing rocks at our trailer. Small ones at first, then larger ones that made the thin metal roof boom like a drum. Dad had had enough. He grabbed his gun and his spotlight this time, a powerful one he used for hunting, and we all poured out onto the front porch. Mum was shining a flashlight around the yard while Dad swept the tree line with his spotlight. The beam caught something at the edge of the woods. There, sitting on a fallen tree stump, was another one of those creatures. Slightly smaller than the one we'd seen before, but unmistakably the same kind of thing. As the light hit its face, its eyes reflected back a yellowish-white glow, like a cat's, but much larger. It didn't run. It just sat there, staring at us, holding a rock the size of a baseball in its massive hand. After a few seconds, it casually tossed the rock onto our driveway with a clatter, stood up, and disappeared into the woods again. We started hearing sounds at night. Not just footsteps or rocks anymore, screams, blood-curdling screams and howls unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not human, not animal, something in between. They would start after midnight and sometimes go until dawn. High-pitched whoops, followed by long moaning calls that echoed through the trees. Sometimes they seemed to be coming from miles away. Other times they sounded like they were right outside our window. Dad finally called the sheriff, who came out and looked around but found nothing except some unusual tracks by the creek. "Probably just coyotes," he said. "They can sound almost human sometimes." But we knew better. The strangest encounter happened in broad daylight. Me and two boys from down the road were walking along Westview, heading to the convenience store about a mile away. It was a bright Saturday afternoon, nothing unusual about it. We were talking about normal kid stuff, baseball cards and video games, when we heard crashing sounds from the woods to our right. We stopped, thinking maybe it was deer. The woods went silent, too silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Then we heard a low grunt. "What was—" my friend started to say. Then they came, 3 of them bursting from the tree line about 50 yards ahead of us. 2 large ones and a smaller one, all covered in dark hair, all running on 2 legs. They crossed the road in seconds and disappeared into the woods on the other side. We ran. God, how we ran. All the way back to my house, not looking back once. When we got there, gasping for breath, my friends refused to come inside. They took off toward their own homes, and I never heard them mention that day again. I think they were too scared of being called crazy. Over the next few months, the activity increased. We'd find our trash cans knocked over and emptied, even though we'd started using bungee cords to secure the lids. We'd discover strange arrangements of sticks in our yard. 3 sticks balanced together like a teepee, or sticks broken and laid out in patterns. Dad eventually found a series of caves along the creek bank, about a 1/4 mile into the woods. Around these caves were more of those massive footprints, 18 inches long at least, with 5 toes and a distinct arch, human-like but impossibly large. He took photos but never showed them to anyone outside the family. One evening, I followed my dad to the creek. He didn't know I was there. I watched as he left a bag of apples on a flat rock near one of the caves. When I asked him about it later, he just said, "Live and let live, Sean. Whatever they are, they haven't hurt us, just scared us some." We never told anyone else about what happened on Westview Road. Who would believe us? We'd be the laughing stock of Cambridge. So we kept it to ourselves, this secret knowledge that something else, something not quite human, shared our little corner of Ohio. By the winter of '93, the encounters had become less frequent. Maybe they migrated, or maybe they just learned to avoid us more carefully. Dad still occasionally left fruit or even sandwich meat by the creek, and it would always be gone the next day. The last time I saw one was just before we moved away, in the summer of '94. I was down by the creek fishing alone when I had the feeling of being watched. I looked up slowly, and there, about 30 yards upstream, standing knee-deep in the water, was one of them. The smaller one we'd seen before. It was using a long stick to probe under the banks, pulling out what looked like crawfish. It saw me. I know it did. But it didn't run this time. It just kept fishing, occasionally glancing my way. After about 10 minutes, it gathered up its catch in what looked like a crude basket made of woven branches, gave me one last look, and walked up the bank into the woods. We moved away that August. Dad got a better job in Akron, and none of us protested too much about leaving. Sometimes at night, I still hear those screams in my dreams, that mix of howl and whoop that doesn't belong to any known animal. I'm 39 now with kids of my own. I've never taken them camping, and they don't understand why. How could they? I've never told them about Westview Road and what lived in those woods. Some things are better left unsaid, but I know what I saw, what we all saw. And sometimes when I'm driving through rural areas with thick forests, I find myself scanning the tree line, just in case, because they're out there. The Meckleys weren't the only ones who knew. The McLeans knew too. And some nights, I still wake up in a cold sweat, hearing heavy footsteps outside my window and feeling the phantom shake of something massive pushing against my home. Story 13. The engine of my ATV growled as I navigated the narrow dirt path between Earl Keating's and Jim Porter's cornfields. It was late, around 11:30 p.m. on a sticky July night in 2017, but I knew these trails like the back of my hand. Had driven them 100 times before. The full moon hung fat and yellow above Knox County, casting long shadows across the farmland that stretched out in every direction. I'd been staying at my buddy Mike's hunting camp about half a mile from the main road and decided to take a late-night ride to clear my head. The corn stood 7 feet tall on both sides of me, creating a narrow corridor that my headlight barely illuminated. The stalks swayed slightly in the night breeze, their leaves rustling with a dry, papery sound that had always been comforting to me. This was home, the Caucasian River area where I'd grown up, where my dad had taught me to hunt, where I felt most at peace. The worn path curved gently to the left ahead of me. I eased off the throttle, slowing to maybe 5 miles per hour as I navigated the turn. The headlight on my Honda Rancher cut through the darkness, illuminating about 20 feet of path ahead. Nothing unusual, just dirt, a few rocks, the wall of corn on either side. And then it hit me. The feeling came without warning, like someone had suddenly dropped a block of ice into my stomach. I felt my entire body tense up, my fingers clenching the handlebars so tight my knuckles went white. Something was wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. I couldn't identify what had caused this reaction. There was no obvious threat, no strange noise, no movement in the corn, nothing visible in the beam of my headlight, but every cell in my body was suddenly screaming at me. Danger, threat, run. I slowed the ATV to a complete stop, the engine idling beneath me. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. Sweat broke out across my forehead and under my arms despite the cool night air. The feeling intensified, a crushing sense of dread, of something hostile and focused directly on me. Then came the nausea. My stomach clenched and rolled, bile rising in my throat. I swallowed hard, trying to keep from vomiting right there on the trail. A pressure built in my chest, like someone was sitting on me, making it hard to draw a full breath. My ears popped, and a low-frequency hum seemed to vibrate through my body rather than actually being heard. And then, most terrifying of all, the voice. Get out. It wasn't audible. It didn't come through my ears. It resonated directly inside my head, clear as day but without sound. I've never experienced anything like it before, or since. Leave now. The words formed in my mind with absolute clarity. Not my own thoughts, but something external pushing its way into my consciousness. The voice, if you could call it that, carried a weight of authority and menace that made my skin crawl. I sat frozen on the ATV, unable to process what was happening. The feeling of being watched intensified. Whatever was out there didn't just see me, it was focused on me with predatory intensity. I felt like prey. Danger. Go. Now. The third mental command snapped me out of my paralysis. I fumbled with the throttle, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it. The ATV lurched forward a few feet, but something felt wrong about continuing down the path. Whatever waited ahead was not something I wanted to encounter. I awkwardly turned the machine around in the narrow trail, the tires digging into the soft dirt at the edge of the cornfield. One sudden movement, and I'd be ploughing into the crops themselves. I managed to complete the turn without tipping over, though my usual coordination had abandoned me completely. As I pointed the ATV back the way I'd come, the pressure in my chest intensified. My vision began to tunnel, darkness creeping in at the edges. The nausea doubled, and I dry heaved once, then again. Nothing came up, but the spasm of my stomach muscles was painful enough to make me gasp. I twisted the throttle and the ATV surged forward, much faster than was safe on the narrow, winding trail. I didn't care. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to get away. Whatever waited in the darkness ahead, or perhaps was already right beside me, hidden in the corn, was something I needed to escape. Now. The path blurred beneath my headlight as I raced back toward Mike's camp. The vibration of the engine traveled up through my body, making my teeth chatter. I kept expecting something to burst from the cornfield at any moment, something massive and fast and hungry. The mental voice had stopped, but the feeling of malevolent attention remained locked on me like a spotlight. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute, I realized the chest pressure was beginning to ease. I could draw fuller breaths. The nausea subsided slightly. I was putting distance between myself and whatever had been out there. By the time I'd traveled about 200 yards back down the trail, the symptoms had decreased enough that I could think more clearly. The feeling of being watched remained, but it felt more distant now, less immediate. The crushing dread had lifted enough that I no longer felt I was in imminent danger of dying from sheer terror. I burst out of the cornfield trail onto the wider dirt road that led to Mike's camp. The open space instantly made me feel safer, though I still didn't slow down. I roared into camp at nearly 20 miles an hour, skidding to a stop near the fire pit where the remains of our earlier cookout had cooled to embers. Mike and our other buddy, Travis, were sitting in folding camp chairs, beers in hand. They both jumped at my sudden arrival. "Jesus Christ, Dan!" Mike shouted. "You trying to kill yourself driving that fast in the dark?" I cut the engine and practically fell off the ATV. My legs felt like rubber, barely supporting my weight. I stumbled over to the cooler and grabbed a bottle of water, downing half of it in one desperate gulp. "You okay, man?" Travis asked, setting his beer down. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I collapsed into an empty chair, my hands still trembling. The physical symptoms had almost completely disappeared now that I was back at camp, but the memory of that voice in my head remained crystal clear. "Something's out there," I said, my voice hoarse. Near the bend in the trail between Keating's and Porter's corn, Mike and Travis exchanged a look. "What, like a coyote?" Mike asked. "Or did old Porter finally get that guard dog he's been threatening?" I shook my head. "No, something bigger, something that got into my head." I told them what had happened, the sudden, overwhelming dread, the physical symptoms, and most importantly, the voice that had formed words directly in my mind. As I spoke, I realized how crazy it all sounded. If someone had told me the same story, I'd have assumed they were drunk or on drugs or just making shit up. "You sure you're not coming down with something?" Travis asked when I finished. "Heat exhaustion can mess with your head, make you see and hear things." "I wasn't seeing things," I insisted. "And I didn't hear anything, not with my ears. It was in my head, like telepathy or something." Mike snorted. "Telepathy? Come on, man." "I know how it sounds," I said, "but something was out there, something that wanted me gone." We stayed up another hour, theorizing about what I might have encountered. Travis suggested infrasound, low-frequency sound waves that humans can't consciously hear, but that can cause exactly the symptoms I'd experienced: fear, nausea, chest pressure. Certain predators can allegedly produce these sounds, he claimed, though he couldn't name which ones. Mike was more skeptical, suggesting I'd worked myself up over nothing, maybe picked up on the presence of a bear or mountain lion, without consciously noticing the signs. The voice was just my own brain trying to protect me. Neither explanation satisfied me, but I was too exhausted to argue. Around 1 a.m., we turned in, retreating to our tents. Despite my exhaustion, sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that presence again, watching, waiting. When I finally did drift off, my dreams were filled with corn stalks parting to reveal something massive moving through the fields, always just out of sight. The next morning, I woke feeling more rational. In the clear light of day, my experience seemed less supernatural. I decided to return to the spot where it had happened. Not alone, though. Mike and Travis agreed to come along, more out of curiosity than belief. We took our ATVs down the trail around 11 a.m. The cornfields looked completely ordinary in daylight, tall stalks of healthy plants stretching toward the sky, rustling gently in the summer breeze. No signs of anything unusual, no massive footprints, no broken stalks, no strange markings. When we reached the bend in the trail where I'd experienced the voice, I felt a slight uneasiness, but nothing like the overwhelming terror of the night before. We dismounted and explored the area for about 20 minutes, finding nothing out of the ordinary. "See? Probably just spooked yourself," Mike said, slapping me on the shoulder. "Happens to everyone sometimes." I nodded, but didn't fully agree. Something had been here, something that didn't want to be seen in daylight. As Mike and Travis mounted their ATVs, I took one last look around. That's when I noticed them. 3 or 4 deer tracks, fresh from the morning, leading from one cornfield across the path and into the other. Deer commonly move through these fields at night, feeding on the corn. Something had been hunting them, something that didn't want human interference. On the drive back to camp, a theory formed in my mind. I'd heard stories all my life about Bigfoot sightings in rural Ohio. Most people dismissed them as tall tales or misidentified bears, but those who claimed to have encountered the creatures often reported telepathic communication. They called it mind speak, the ability of Sasquatch to project thoughts directly into human consciousness. I'd always scoffed at these stories. But now, having experienced something that defied rational explanation, I wasn't so quick to dismiss them. What if a Sasquatch had been hunting deer in those cornfields? What if it had detected my approach and warned me away from its hunting ground? Over the remaining 3 days of our camping trip, I returned to the trail several times, always in daylight, always with Mike or Travis. Nothing unusual happened, but each time I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed from a distance. Whatever had communicated with me that night was still out there, watching from the shadows, keeping its distance but never completely disappearing. On our last evening, as we packed up the campsite, Mike finally admitted that he believed something had happened to me on that trail. "I've known you 20 years, Dan," he said, rolling up his sleeping bag. "You're not the type to make shit up or get spooked over nothing. If you say something was out there, I believe you." "Thanks," I said. "I just wish I knew what it was." "Maybe it's better not to know," Travis chimed in. "Some mysteries are meant to stay mysteries." As we drove away from Knox County the next morning, I kept glancing back at those cornfields in my rearview mirror. The scientific part of my brain wanted to explain away the experience: infrasound, overactive imagination, a minor medical episode. But deep down, I knew what I'd experienced wasn't ordinary. Something intelligent had reached into my mind that night. Something that could think, reason, and communicate. Something that had assessed me as a threat or unwanted intruder and had the power to make me physically ill from a distance. Whether it was a cryptid like Sasquatch or something else entirely, I couldn't say for certain. What I do know is that I've returned to Knox County many times since that summer. I've even driven that same trail between the cornfields. But never again after dark. Some warnings you only need to hear once, especially when they bypass your ears and speak directly to your mind. And sometimes even now, 5 years later, I'll be drifting off to sleep and hear it again, faint but distinct. Get out. And I know, whatever it was that found me that night, it's still out there, watching, waiting, keeping its secrets in the darkness between the corn. Story 14. I still can't sleep right, even after 3 weeks. The pills Doc Harmon gave me barely take the edge off. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that sound again, that goddamn sound no human should ever hear. But I need to put this down somewhere, make some sense of what happened to us that night in Shawnee. My name's Steve Ernst. I'm 16, live just outside of Portsmouth, Ohio, been hunting since I was 8. Nothing fancy, just following my old man's footsteps like most boys around here. This was supposed to be a regular coon hunt. Me, my cousin Dale, and 2 older guys from town, Hank Miller and Bill Copeland. They'd been hunting these woods for decades, knew every creek and ridge in Adams County, or so they claimed. We headed out October 29th, late afternoon. The plan was simple. Drive to the eastern edge of Shawnee State Forest, let the dogs track some raccoons until midnight or so, then head back with whatever we caught. The forest was starting to change colors, that perfect mix of orange and red that makes these hills famous. The forecast mentioned possible flurries, but nothing serious. Hank's old Ford pickup rattled down the service road, deeper into the forest than I'd ever been before. The sun was already setting when we parked in a small clearing and unloaded the dogs. 2 blue-tick hounds named Sadie and Tucker. They were excited, pulling at their leashes, noses already working the air. "Gonna be a good night, boys," Bill said, adjusting his cap. He was a tall man, lean as a rail, with calloused hands that never seemed to stay still. Dogs smell something already. Hank checked his rifle, an old Remington that looked like it had seen more hunts than I'd had birthdays. "We're heading toward Turkey Creek. Good spot this time of year." We grabbed our gear, rifles, flashlights, extra ammo, and some jerky for the night, and headed into the trees. The dogs led the way, and I brought up the rear, making sure to keep pace. The woods grew darker with each step, the trees closing in around us like silent watchers. 2 hours in, the temperature dropped. Fast. I could feel it seeping through my jacket, turning my breath into small white clouds. The ground crunched beneath our boots as a light snow began to fall. "Don't remember the forecast calling for this much snow," Dale muttered beside me, zipping his jacket higher. "Weather changes quick in these hills," Hank replied, not looking back. "We'll be fine." The snow picked up, covering the forest floor in white. Our flashlight beams cut yellow paths through the darkness, catching snowflakes in their glow. The dogs were working a trail, moving us deeper into the woods, following some creek I didn't recognize. By 9:30 p.m. we'd gone much farther than planned. The dogs had led us at least 5 miles in, maybe more, following Turkey Creek as it wound through a narrow valley. The snow was coming down steady now, maybe 2 inches on the ground. "Let's take 5, Bill called out, and we stopped along the creek bank. That's when I saw them. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks. The flashlight beam swept across the fresh snow along the creek, illuminating a line of massive depressions. Not deer tracks, not bear tracks, not any animal I'd ever seen. "Hey!" I called, my voice suddenly thin. "Look at this." I trained my light directly on the prints. They were huge, 16 inches long if they were an inch, and wide as my forearm. The shape was unmistakable, a bare human foot but 3 times normal size. The snow around each depression was clean, showing 5 distinct toes. I counted 10, maybe 15 tracks heading upstream. "Very funny, guys," I said, looking at Hank and Bill. "Which one of you made these?" But when I raised my light to their faces, I knew instantly they hadn't done it. Hank's weathered face had gone pale, his mouth slightly open. Bill was already crouching down, examining the nearest print with trembling fingers. "Sweet Jesus," Bill whispered. "These are fresh. 10 minutes old, tops." Dale stepped closer to me, our shoulders touching. "What makes tracks like that?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Nothing," Hank said flatly. "Nothing makes tracks like that." The dogs had gone quiet, which wasn't right. Sadie and Tucker should have been going crazy over a scent this fresh, but instead they'd backed away from the creek, tails tucked between their legs. "We should head back," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. Bill stood up slowly. Yeah, that's..." He stopped mid-sentence, staring past me over my shoulder. I turned to follow his gaze and felt my stomach drop. About 100 yards up the creek, hovering between the trees, was a blue light. Not the white beam of a flashlight or the yellow flicker of a lantern. This was electric blue, the size of a softball, floating 5 feet off the ground. It pulsed slightly, like a heartbeat. "Someone else out here?" Dale whispered. The light moved. Not like someone walking with a lamp, but smoothly, like it was gliding. It drifted sideways, then stopped. No sound accompanied it. "Hello?" Hank called out, his voice echoing through the trees. "Anyone there?" The blue orb dimmed slightly, then brightened. It moved again, this time toward us, stopping after about 20 feet. "Let's go," Bill said quietly. "Now." We turned back the way we'd come, moving quickly but trying not to run. The dogs didn't need any encouragement, pulling hard on their leashes. I glanced back after 50 yards. The light was following us. "It's coming," I hissed. "Don't run," Hank ordered. "Just keep walking." For the next hour, we made our way back through the forest with that blue light trailing behind us. When we stopped, it stopped. When we moved, it moved. Sometimes it would vanish behind trees, only to reappear closer than before. The temperature kept dropping, the snow now ankle-deep, but I was sweating beneath my jacket. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the blue light winked out. Gone. "Is it?" Dale started to ask. That's when we heard it. The sound began as a low moan, so faint I thought it might be the wind. But there was no wind. The forest was dead silent, the snow dampening everything. The moan grew louder, a wailing that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. It sounded like a woman in terrible pain, or grief so profound it couldn't be contained. The cry echoed off the hills, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, though I knew none of us had an answer. The wailing changed pitch, rising higher, becoming more desperate. The dogs whimpered, pressing themselves against our legs. Hank's face was rigid, his knuckles white around his rifle. And then the sound transformed again. The woman's cry shifted, morphing into something even more terrifying, the unmistakable wail of an infant, a baby screaming in the darkness, miles from any home or road. "This isn't right," Bill muttered. "This isn't natural." The infant's cry continued, piercing the night. 10 minutes it went on, never pausing for breath as we stumbled through the snow trying to find our way back to the truck. Our flashlight beams jerked wildly across trees and underbrush. I was disoriented, panic making it hard to think. "This way," Hank insisted, pointing left, though I wasn't sure he really knew anymore. That's when the crashing started. Behind us, maybe 50 yards back, something large moved through the underbrush. Not the careful steps of a deer, or even the lumbering gait of a bear. This was heavy, deliberate. Branches snapped, small trees shook. "Go," Bill said. "Go now." We abandoned any pretense of calm and ran. The dogs sprinted ahead, yanking their leashes from Bill's hands and disappearing into the darkness. My lungs burned in the cold air. Branches whipped at my face. I could hear Dale's ragged breathing beside me and the heavier footfalls of Hank and Bill behind. And behind them, getting closer, the crashing continued. Somehow, Hank found the way. After 20 terrifying minutes of running, the trees thinned, and I saw the outline of his pickup in the clearing. The dogs were already there, huddled in their boxes in the truck bed, shivering. We piled in, Hank fumbling with the keys, the engine turning over once, twice before catching. The headlights swept across the tree line as we turned around. For just a moment, a single frozen instant, I thought I saw something step back into the shadows, something tall, but Hank hit the gas, and we were speeding down the service road, tires slipping on the fresh snow. No one spoke for the first 10 minutes. Then Dale broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice still shaking. Bill shook his head. "Don't know. Don't want to know." "Those tracks," I said. "They were—" "We don't talk about it," Hank cut in, his eyes fixed on the road. "Not tonight, not tomorrow, not ever." But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Those massive, bare footprints in the snow, that blue light, watching us like it had intelligence. The woman's cry that became a baby's wail. The thing following us, herding us out of the forest. We dropped Bill off first, then Dale. When Hank pulled up to my house, he turned to me before I could get out. "Steve," he said, his face grey with exhaustion. "People been hunting these woods for 200 years. Some have seen things that don't make sense. Most folks who see 'em keep quiet because who'd believe it? But there's stories." "What kind of stories?" I asked. He stared through the windshield at the falling snow. "Old stories, about something living in the deepest parts of Shawnee, something that was here before us." He looked at me directly. "Your folks asked, we got spooked by the weather and turned back early. That's all." I nodded and got out of the truck. That was 3 weeks ago. Dale won't talk about it. Says he doesn't remember much, which is bullshit. I know he remembers. I've called Bill twice, but his wife says he's not taking calls. Hank still nods to me when I see him at the hardware store, but he walks the other way. I tried researching, looking for similar accounts. There's not much, a few vague stories from hunters, some old newspaper clippings about strange lights in Shawnee dating back to the 1920s. One account from 1978 mentioned unearthly wailing heard by a family camping near Turkey Creek. The footprints bother me the most. I've measured my own foot, just under 11 inches. Whatever left those tracks in the snow was walking barefoot in freezing temperatures, with feet half again as large as any human I've ever seen. Last night, I dreamed I was back in those woods. The blue light was there, leading me deeper into the trees. I followed it until I reached a clearing I'd never seen before. Standing in the center was a figure, too tall to be human, its outline blurred in the darkness. It turned toward me, and that's when I woke up, sweating despite the cold in my room. I haven't told my parents, haven't told anyone really. Who would believe it? 4 hunters, 2 of them grown men with decades of experience, running scared from lights and sounds. We'd be laughingstocks in Portsmouth. But I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know I'm never going back to Shawnee State Forest again, not in October, not ever, because something lives in those ancient hills and hollows, something that watches with blue fire, something that cries like a woman and a child, something that walks on bare feet through freezing snow. And I think it let us leave because we were in its territory, uninvited guests it decided to spare. This time, I still wake up at night, thinking I hear that infant wailing outside my window. Dad says it's just the wind in the maple trees, but I know better. It found me once. I'm afraid it might find me again. Story 15. I never believed in monsters. Not the real kind, anyway. Growing up in rural Ohio, I'd heard my share of campfire tales and local legends, but I kept my feet planted firmly in reality. That changed in October 2014. My husband Dale and I were driving back to our home in Somerset after visiting my sister in Columbus. It was late, around 12:30 a.m., and State Route 13 stretched before us like a black ribbon cutting through the darkness. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky, and a half moon provided just enough light to see the silhouettes of trees lining the road. "You want to stop for coffee?" Dale asked, glancing at me from the driver's seat. I shook my head. "We're only 20 minutes from home. I just want to get there and crawl into bed." Dale nodded, his eyes returning to the road. Our headlights carved a path through the darkness, illuminating the yellow center line and the occasional reflective marker. The radio played softly, some late-night talk show that neither of us was really listening to. The car's heater hummed gently, keeping the October chill at bay. We'd just passed the turnoff for Thornville when it happened. The road curved slightly to the right, and as Dale navigated the bend, something burst from the tree line on the left side of the road. At first, it was just a blur of movement, a massive shadow charging directly toward our car. "Shit!" Dale shouted, jerking the wheel. The thing hit us before he could fully swerve away. A tremendous thud shook the entire vehicle, followed by the screech of metal as something scraped along the driver's side. The impact jolted us sideways, tires squealing as Dale fought to keep us on the road. "What the hell was that?" he yelled, knuckles white on the steering wheel as he brought the car to a stop on the shoulder. My heart hammered against my ribs. "A deer," I suggested, though even as I said it, I knew better. The shape had been all wrong. "That wasn't a deer," Dale said, echoing my thoughts. "Maybe a dog. A really big dog." We sat there for a few seconds, both of us breathing hard, trying to process what had just happened. Then Dale reached for the door handle. "Don't!" I grabbed his arm. "What if it's still out there?" "We hit something, Sarah. We need to check if it's hurt." Dale was right. If we'd hit someone's pet, or even a wild animal, we couldn't just drive away. He flicked on the hazard lights and reached into the glove compartment for the flashlight we kept there. "Stay in the car," he said. "Lock the doors after me." I nodded, my throat tight with fear. Dale stepped out, closing the door behind him, and I immediately hit the lock button. Through the window, I watched as he swept the flashlight beam across the road and the grassy area beyond the shoulder. That's when I saw it. The flashlight beam caught a pair of eyes at the edge of the trees, yellow eyes that reflected the light back like polished brass coins. They were set high off the ground, much higher than a dog's would be. Even a Great Dane wouldn't stand that tall. "Dale!" I screamed, rolling down my window just enough to be heard. "Get back in the car!" He turned toward me, confusion on his face, then swung the flashlight toward where I was pointing. The beam landed on the creature just as it rose to its full height. Standing on its hind legs, it towered at least 7 feet tall. Its body was massive, covered in brownish-gray fur that looked coarse and matted in the flashlight beam. But it was the face that made my blood run cold, an elongated snout, more wolf-like than bear, with upright pointed ears and those terrible yellow eyes now fixed directly on Dale. Dale didn't hesitate. He sprinted back to the car, yanked open the door, and threw himself inside. His hands shook as he fumbled with the keys, dropping them once before managing to get them into the ignition. "Go, go, go!" I shouted, my eyes still fixed on the creature. It dropped back to all fours and took a step toward us. Its movement was fluid, powerful, like nothing I'd ever seen before. Not like a bear or a wolf or any animal native to Ohio. As Dale gunned the engine, it opened its mouth, revealing rows of gleaming teeth. We peeled away, tires spinning on the asphalt. In the side mirror, I caught one last glimpse of the creature standing in the middle of the road, watching us leave. Then Dale took a sharp curve, and it disappeared from view. "What the fuck was that?" Dale's voice cracked as he pushed the speedometer past 70. I couldn't answer. My mind raced through possibilities. Escaped exotic pet, some kind of mutated wolf, a bear with mange, but none of them fit what we'd just seen. "We need to go back," I said finally. Dale looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Are you serious? Did you see that thing?" "We need proof," I insisted. "No one's going to believe us otherwise." Deep down, I knew there was another reason I wanted to go back. This wasn't my first encounter with something unexplainable in the woods of Ohio, and some part of me needed confirmation that I wasn't crazy, that what I'd seen as a child had been real. Dale slowed the car, hesitated, then made a U-turn on the empty highway. "We stay in the car," he said firmly. "Windows up. If we see it again, we leave. Immediately." I agreed, though my heart was racing so hard I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. We drove slowly back to the spot where we'd hit the creature. Dale kept the high beams on, illuminating both sides of the road as we searched. There was nothing. No massive beast, no blood on the pavement, no signs of disturbance in the underbrush. It was as if the whole incident had never happened. "Maybe it ran off into the woods," Dale suggested. But we both knew that was unlikely. Something that size, possibly injured from the impact with our car, shouldn't have been able to disappear so completely. We circled the area twice more before giving up. As we pulled back onto Route 13 to head home, Dale switched on the dome light so I could look at the car's damage. The entire driver's side was dented inward, the metal crumpled like tissue paper. Long scratch marks ran from the front fender to the rear door, deep enough that they'd cut through the paint to the metal beneath. But it was what covered the damage that made my stomach turn, a thick, viscous substance that looked like a mixture of blood, mucus, and saliva. In the harsh dome light, it glistened wetly against the dark paint of our car. "Jesus Christ," Dale muttered, switching the light off again. "We need to report this." "To who?" I asked. "The police? Game wardens? What are we going to tell them? That we hit Bigfoot's angry cousin on Route 13? Dale was quiet for a moment, his jaw working as he processed everything. "We'll figure it out when we get home," he said finally. The rest of the drive passed in tense silence. Every shadow at the roadside made me flinch. Every sound from the damaged side of the car sent shivers up my spine. By the time we pulled into our driveway in Somerset, I was wound so tight I thought I might snap. Under the outdoor lights of our garage, the damage looked even worse. The substance coating the car had begun to dry in some places, turning a crusty brownish black. And the smell, dear God, the smell. It hit us as soon as we stepped out of the car, a stench so foul it made my eyes water, like rotting meat, wet dog, and something else I couldn't identify, something chemical and wrong. "We need to clean this off," Dale said, pulling his shirt up over his nose. "Right now." I nodded, too nauseated to speak. While Dale fetched the hose and soap from the garage, I stood staring at the damage, my mind wandering back to a summer day 20 years earlier, when I was just 11 years old. My friend Lizzie and I had been walking along the railroad tracks near Glenford, killing time on a lazy Sunday afternoon. We'd been picking blackberries from bushes that grew alongside the tracks, our fingers and lips stained purple with juice. The day was hot, cicadas buzzing in the trees, and we'd wandered farther than we usually did, following the tracks into a wooded area where they curved around a small hill. That's when we heard it, the sound of crunching leaves behind us. At first we ignored it, thinking it was just a squirrel or some other small animal. But then the crunching got louder, more deliberate. We turned around simultaneously and saw it. About 30 feet away, crouched beside the tracks, was a figure that looked like a gorilla. But there were no gorillas in Ohio, and even in my 11-year-old mind, I knew this was something else, something wrong. It had the same brownish-grey fur I'd see again years later on Route 13, the same general shape, though I couldn't make out its face clearly from that distance. It was watching us, perfectly still, except for its chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Lizzie and I ran. We ran like we'd never run before, not looking back, not stopping until we reached the main road nearly a mile away. Neither of us ever talked about what we saw, and within a year, Lizzie's family had moved to Cincinnati. I convinced myself it had been a bear, or maybe even a man in a costume playing a prank, and eventually the memory faded to the back of my mind. Until tonight. The spray of cold water from the hose hit the car, snapping me back to the present. Dale had already started scrubbing at the substance, his face twisted in disgust. "This stuff isn't coming off easy," he grunted, applying more pressure to the sponge. I grabbed another sponge and joined him, fighting the urge to vomit as the water loosened the foul-smelling mixture and it began to run down the driveway. We worked in silence for nearly an hour, scrubbing until our arms ached, before the car was finally clean. The dents and scratches remained, of course, but at least the biological evidence of our encounter was gone. "We'll take it to Hank's body shop tomorrow," Dale said, coiling the hose. "Tell him we hit a deer." I nodded, though the thought of lying left a bitter taste in my mouth. But what choice did we have? The truth would sound insane. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying both encounters in my mind. Whatever I'd seen, both as a child and tonight, it wasn't something that should exist in the woods of Ohio. It wasn't something that should exist at all. 2 days later, we dropped the car off at Hank's body shop. He whistled when he saw the damage. "Must have been one hell of a deer," he said, running his hand along the dents. "Yeah," Dale agreed, not meeting my eyes. "Came out of nowhere." Hank leaned closer, examining the scratches. "These are odd," he remarked. "Never seen a deer do damage quite like this before." I held my breath, waiting for him to question us further, but he just shrugged and wrote up an estimate. As we were leaving, though, he called after us. "You know, you're the third folks this month to hit something big out on Route 13. His voice was casual, but when I turned back, there was something in his eyes, a knowing look. "Jim Peterson brought in his truck last week, said he hit a deer too. Funny thing was, the damage was almost identical to yours. Same side of the vehicle, same kind of scratches." "Is that right?" Dale's voice was strained. Hank nodded slowly. "You folks be careful driving at night around here, especially out near those woods." He paused, then added, "Some things are better left alone." We drove home in Dale's truck, both of us quiet, processing Hank's words. Were there others who had seen what we saw? Who had encountered the creature but, like us, were too afraid of sounding crazy to speak the truth? Over the next few weeks, I did research. I looked up local legends, animal sightings, anything that might explain what we'd encountered. I found scattered reports, a hunter who claimed to have seen a wolf walking like a man near Buckeye Lake in the 1970s, a family who reported something large and bipedal crossing Route 13 in the early 2000s. Even a newspaper article from 1923 about livestock killings attributed to an unusually large predator in Licking County. None of it was conclusive, but it was enough to convince me that Dale and I weren't alone in what we'd seen. Something was out there in the woods and fields of rural Ohio, something that walked the line between animal and monster. We don't drive Route 13 at night anymore. When friends ask about the damage to our car, we tell them about the deer we supposedly hit. Sometimes I catch Dale staring out at the tree line behind our property, his eyes scanning the shadows as if looking for movement. I haven't told him about what I saw as a child. Some part of me is still trying to keep those two encounters separate, as if acknowledging the connection would make the creature more real, more persistent in our lives. But on clear nights when the moon is high, I sometimes think I hear heavy footsteps in our yard, a strange scraping at the walls of our house, and sometimes, just for a moment, I catch a flash of yellow eyes watching from the darkness beyond our windows. I never believed in monsters. Now I know better. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear, and one of them prowls the back roads of Ohio, waiting for unwary travelers to cross its path.